Welcome to another video on stories of our history. In the spring of the year 835 CE, on a small, isolated farmstead clinging to the edge of the Sonefjord in western Norway, a child named Bjorn, though his true name has been lost to the deep, silent currents of the past, drew his first, gasping, and fiercely contested breath. The world that greeted him was not the soft, warm, and protected nursery of the modern imagination, but a dark, smoky, and deeply perilous longhouse, a world of the hissing, spitting, and the constantly, hungrily, consuming fire, the low, oppressive, and the reeking roof of the peat and the turf, the constant, gnawing, and the bone-deep chill of the northern winter, and the ever-present, the silent, and the utterly indifferent, threat of the starvation, the disease, and the sudden, violent, and the deeply anonymous death that was the common, and the profoundly expected, lot of the early medieval human being. The Viking Age, which was then, in the early 9th century, just beginning its long, bloody, and the world-transforming arc, was not, in its deepest, and its most the fundamental, reality, a world of the adult, male, and the sea-born, martial adventure that dominates the sagas, the chronicles, and the modern, popular imagination. It was, in the first, and the most the essential, instance, a world of the child. The family, and the desperate, the unrelenting, and the profoundly innovative struggle for the survival, a struggle that was, in its very nature, a struggle that began, not at the age of the conscription or the first raid, but at the very moment of the birth, and that was, from that moment on, the central, the defining, and the utterly inescapable reality of the human, the social, and the profoundly formative experience of every single Viking Age Norseman and woman. The childhood of the Vikings, the long, harsh, and the deeply intentional process of the training, the conditioning, and the profoundly transformative initiation that turned the helpless, the vulnerable, and the utterly dependent infant into the resilient, the skilled, and the fiercely independent adult, was not a passive, a biologically determined, or the culturally neutral phase of the life. It was a rigorous, a meticulously designed, and a deeply effective system of the education, the socialization, and the profoundly psychological engineering, a system that was, in its very essence, the hidden, and the utterly essential foundation of the entire, astonishing, and the deeply terrifying phenomenon that we call the Viking Age, a system that was, in the words of the sagas, the uppeldi, the bringing up, the rearing, the process that forged the human, raw material of the North into the living, breathing, and the deeply formidable instruments of the survival, the expansion, and the ultimately, the self-destructive glory of the pagan warrior culture. To understand the true, the essential, and the profoundly formative nature of the Viking childhood, we must first, and the necessarily, strip away the layers of the modern, and the deeply sentimentalized assumptions about the innocence, the play, and the protected, and the extended dependency of the young, assumptions that were, in the 9th century, Scandinavia, not merely the absent, but the actively, and the utterly contradicted by the brutal, and the deeply pragmatic realities of the daily existence. The infant mortality rate, in the pre-Christian, and the pre-modern, North, was a staggering, and a deeply sobering statistic, a statistic that, though it cannot be the precisely quantified, was, by all the available, historical, and the comparative, evidence, in the range of the 30 to the 50%, a rate that meant that, of every 2 children who were born, 1 would not live to see the 5th anniversary of their birth, a rate that was, in its very magnitude, a constant, a knowing, and a deeply traumatizing presence in the emotional, and the psychological, life of the parents, a presence that, in the deeply pagan, and the profoundly fatalistic worldview of the Norse, was the work of the Norns, the goddesses of the fate, the the Verandi, and the Skald, who wove, at the foot of the world tree, the unalterable, and the profoundly just destiny of every human being. A destiny that the child, from its first breath, was the subject, and the utterly powerless object of a cosmic, and the deeply indifferent decree. The child who survived, the child who, by the sheer, and the deeply mysterious grace of the Hummingjä, the personal luck being born, and the divinely given fortune was the child who was, from that moment, marked, and the profoundly selected for the life of the struggle, the endurance, and the ultimate, and the deeply cherished contribution to the survival and the prosperity of the clan. The lineage, the sacred, and the deeply demanding collective that was the true, the fundamental, and the utterly central unit of the Norse social and the spiritual order. The child was not, in this deeply communal and the profoundly ancestral world, the unique, the precious, and the deeply individually loved individual of the modern, Western, nuclear family. It was a link, a thread, and the deeply essential component of the eternal and the unbreakable chain of a chain that stretched from the dim and the profoundly mythical past of the gods and the heroes, through the living and the deeply struggling present of the farm and the feud, and into the unknown and the deeply hoped for future of the descendants, a chain that the child, by its survival, its training, and its the ultimate, and the deeply honorable death, was the sacred, and the profoundly obligated to strengthen, to extend, and to the eternally preserve. The formal, and the deeply symbolic entry of the newborn into this sacred, and the profoundly demanding chain of the was the ritual of the Nafvestra, the name-giving, a ritual that was, in its social, and its deeply religious significance, the moment of the legal, the spiritual, and the profoundly irreversible acceptance of the child into the family, the clan, and the community of the living, the dead and the gods. The father, the husbandi, the master of the house, who had, by the ancient and the deeply cherished law of the Gulathing, the absolute and the utterly unchallengeable right to decide whether the newborn, particularly if it was the weak, the deformed, or the female, would be the exposed, the born the carried out, to die of the cold and the hunger on the barren hillside, a right that was, in its stark and the profoundly brutal exercise, a direct and a deeply chilling reflection of the harsh and the utterly unforgiving calculus of the survival, a calculus that was, in the eyes of the Norse, a necessity, a duty, and the deeply tragic, but the unalterable law of the nature and the fate. If the child was the accepted, the father, in the presence of the assembled household and the witnesses, would sprinkle the child with the water, the vatni osa, a pre-Christian, and the deeply ancient ritual of the purification and the dedication, and would then bestow upon it the name, the nafn, a name that was, in the vast majority of the cases, not a new, an original, or the personally chosen creation, but an ancestral name, the name of a deceased, and the deeply revered grandfather, grandmother, or the heroic uncle, a name that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly animistic understanding, a vessel, a carrier, and the deeply potent transmitter of the Humingja, the luck, the spirit, and the profoundly personal qualities of the deceased ancestor, a name that, in the act of the bestowal, was the literal and the profoundly mystical reincarnation of the dead in the body of the living, a reincarnation that was, in the eyes of the community, the guarantee of the continuity, the stability, and the deeply cherished permanence of the a permanence that was the ultimate and the most the sacred value of the Viking age and the profoundly pagan world. The archaeological record of the Viking age childhood, the silent and the deeply fragmentary, but the profoundly revealing physical traces of the lives, the activities, and the deeply personal experiences of the young, has, in the recent decades, been revolutionized by the careful, the meticulous, and the theoretically sophisticated excavation and the analysis of the children's graves. The toys, the tools, and the deeply intimate spatial arrangements of the longhouse, a revolution that has, for the first time, allowed the modern historian and the archaeologist to see, with a clarity that was, for the centuries, the utterly impossible, the true, the material, and the profoundly human reality of the Viking childhood, a reality that is, in its very nature, a reality that is both the deeply familiar and the profoundly alien, a reality of the love, the loss, the play, the work, and the deeply premature assumption of the adult responsibilities, a Reality that is, in the words of the archaeologists, the small finds of the young, the miniature, and the deeply evocative objects that were the tools, the symbols, and the deeply cherished possessions of the children who lived, and they all too often died, in the dark, smoky, and the profoundly challenging world of the 9th and the 10th centuries. The graves of the Viking Age children, which are found in the cemeteries of the major trading centers such as the Birka, in the Lake Mälaren of the Sweden, the Koppang, in the Vestfold of the Norway, and the Hedeby, in the Schleswig-Holstein of the modern Germany, as well as in the countless, small, and the deeply isolated farm cemeteries of the Icelandic and the Norwegian countryside, are, in their very nature, the deeply poignant and the profoundly informative windows into the lives, the deaths, and the deeply personal identities of the young, windows that reveal, with a stark and a deeply moving clarity, the immense and the deeply unacknowledged emotional investment that the Norse adults, despite the harsh and the deeply fatalistic dictates of their culture, placed in the survival, the well-being, and the deeply hoped-for future of their children. The grave goods that accompany the Viking Age children are, in their variety, their quality, and their the deeply symbolic significance, the direct, and the profoundly illuminating material evidence of the specific, and the deeply gendered training, the skills, and the profoundly aspirational identities that the parents and the community sought to cultivate and to the permanently associate with the deceased child, an association that was, in the pagan and the profoundly animistic belief system, a necessary and the deeply effective provision for the child's journey to the afterlife, a journey that was, in the Norse cosmos, a journey to the realm of the Hel, the goddess of the death, or, for the exceptionally brave and the deeply fortunate, the journey to the Valhalla, the hall of the Odin, where the child, who had died with the courage and the spirit of the warrior, would be welcomed, and the eternally trained for the final and the cosmic battle of the Ragnarok. The boys' graves, from the earliest and the most immodest farm burials to the rich and the deeply aristocratic chamber graves of the Birka, are frequently furnished with the miniature and the often the fully functional weapons, the small but the perfectly balanced wooden or the iron swords, the tiny and the deeply sharp spearheads, the perfectly scaled shields, and the small and the deeply efficient bows and the arrows, a collection that was, in its very nature, not a set of the passive and the merely symbolic grave offerings, but the direct and the profoundly practical material testament to the early and the deeply intensive training in the arts of the hunting, the combat, and the fundamental skills of the warrior, a training that began, as the sagas vividly, and the often, the deeply, shockingly, recount, at the age of the 6, the 7, or the 8. A training that was, in the words of the Egil saga, the training that turned the young Egil Skallagrimsson, who was, at the age of the 7, already the master of the axe and the deeply violent temper that would make him the most feared and the most celebrated warrior poet of his generation, into a living and the profoundly terrifying embodiment of the ancient and the deeply pagan warrior code. The girls' graves, by the contrast, are furnished not with the weapons of the war, but with the tools, the symbols, and the deeply essential instruments of the domestic and the profoundly female-centered economy of the farm and the household, the economy that was, as we have seen in the earlier episodes, the true, the hidden, and the utterly essential foundation of the entire male and the seaborn adventure of the Viking Age. The miniature and the deeply exquisite spindle whorls, the small and the beautifully crafted weaving swords, the tiny but the perfectly functional wool combs, the shears, and the deeply personal collections of the imported glass and the amber beads that are found in the graves of the young Viking girls, from the remote Icelandic farmsteads to the bustling and the deeply cosmopolitan cemeteries of the Hedeby, are not the mere, the passive, or the symbolically feminine trinkets. They are the direct and the profoundly practical material evidence of the early and the deeply intensive training in the complex, the highly skilled, and the physically demanding arts of the textile production, the spinning, the weaving, the dyeing, and the finishing of the wool, the linen, and the sailcloth, the arts that were, in the Viking Age, the exclusive, the deeply cherished, and the economically essential domain of the female, the Husfrida and her daughters, a training that began, as the archaeological and the saga evidence suggests, at the age of the 5 or the 6, a training that was, in the hands of the experienced and the deeply authoritative mother, the process of the transmitting, across the generations, the sacred and the profoundly secret knowledge of the female, industrial, and the magical power, a power that was, in the words of the sagas, the power of the seer, the shamanic, ecstatic, and the profoundly feminine magic of the goddess Freya, a magic that the young girl, by her skill at the loom, was the beginning, and the deeply, reverently, to learn. The physical, and the deeply, practical, training of the Viking child was, from the earliest age, a training that was not confined to the formal, the structured, or the artificially separated space of the school, the classroom, or the specialized institution, but that was, instead, the integrated, the constant, and the utterly immersive experience of the daily life, the work, and the deeply communal labor of the farm, the forest, and the sea, a training that was, in its very nature, a form of the learning by the doing, the jilfun, the practice, the drill, and the profoundly embodied acquisition of the essential and the life-sustaining skills, the skills that were, for the Norse, the true and the only curriculum, a curriculum that was, in the words of the Havamal, the poem of the Odin's wisdom, the curriculum of the wisdom, the moderation, and the constant vigilance, a curriculum that was taught, not by the professional, the detached, or the specially trained teachers, but by the parents, the grandparents, the older siblings, and the deeply experienced and the profoundly respected members of the clan, a curriculum that was, in its very essence, the transmission, across the generations, of the accumulated, the hard-won, and the eternally tested knowledge of the survival, the knowledge that was, in the harsh and the deeply unforgiving environment of the North, the only, and the utterly reliable guarantee of the life, the prosperity, and the deeply cherished continuity of the family and the community. The training of the young Viking boy, the future Bondi, the farmer, the hunter, the fisherman, and the warrior, was, from the moment he could walk, and handle the small, and the deeply functional tools, a training that was, in its physical, and its the deeply practical demands, a training that was designed to develop the strength, the endurance, the agility, and the profoundly stoic indifference to the cold, the hunger, the pain, and the fatigue, that were the essential, and the non-negotiable prerequisites of the male, and the profoundly violent life. The boy would follow his father, his uncle, or his older brothers into the forest, the Myrkr, the dark, and the deeply sacred wilderness that was the source of the timber, the game, and the profoundly dangerous, and the animistic spirits, a forest that was, in the Norse imagination, the liminal, and the deeply testing ground of the courage, the skill, and the deeply personal Kamingja, and he would learn by the patient, and the often, the deeply painful observation, the imitation, and the gradual, and the progressively challenging practice, the arts of the tracking, the stalking, and the killing of the wild animals, the arts of the fishing, the fowling, and the deeply essential collection of the wild herbs, the berries, and the edible roots, the arts that were, in the Norse economy, the arts that were the essential, and the often, the life-saving supplement to the precarious, and the deeply vulnerable agricultural base of the farm. He would learn, by the constant, and the deeply repetitive labor, the skills of the woodcraft, the felling of the great pines and the birches, the splitting, the hewing, and the shaping of the timber, the construction of the houses, the barns, the boats, and the deeply essential fences and the fortifications, the skills that were, in the Viking Age, the skills that were the foundation of the material, and the profoundly impressive civilization of the North, a civilization that was, in its very nature, a civilization of the wood, the iron, and the deeply skilled, and the endlessly patient human hand. The parallel, and the equally demanding, training of the young Viking girl was, in its essence, a training that was the mirror, and the deeply complementary image of the boys, a training that was focused not on the external, the martial, and the wilderness skills, but on the internal, the domestic, the agricultural, and the profoundly female-centered arts that were the true, the hidden, and the utterly essential engine of the Norse social and the economic order. The girl, from the age of the 5 or the 6, would be the constant, and the deeply involved, companion of her mother, her grandmother, and her aunts, in the daily, and the seasonally, demanding, round of the household labor, a labor that was, in its sheer, the physical, and the time-consuming, magnitude, a labor that the modern, and the deeply industrialized, world has largely, and the comfortably forgotten, a labor that was, for the women of the Viking age, the labor that filled the entire waking day, from the first gray light of the dawn to the last flickering flame of the hearth fire. The girl would learn by the patient, and the deeply frustrating process of the trial and the error, under the watchful, and the deeply critical eye of her mother, the complex, and the profoundly skilled sequence of the tasks that were the core of the female textile production, the shearing of the sheep, the sorting, the washing, the carding, and the spinning of the wool, the intricate, and the physically demanding, weaving on the great, upright, warp-weighted loom, the vefster that dominated the main, living hall of the longhouse, a loom that was, in its very presence, a constant, and a deeply symbolic reminder of the female, economic, and the sacred power, a power that the young girl, by her patient, and the increasingly skilled labor, was the beginning, and the deeply, reverently, to inherit. The games, the toys, and the deeply serious play of the Viking children, which are preserved in the archaeological record as the miniature and the deeply evocative objects of the wood, the bone, the antler, and the rarely surviving textile, were not, in the modern and the deeply sentimentalized sense, the activities of the carefree, the innocent, or the purposeless recreation. They were, in the true and the profoundly functional nature, the simulative, the educational, and the deeply intentional training exercises, the exercises that were designed by the adult society to inculcate in the young the specific physical, cognitive, and the profoundly social skills that were the essential and the non-negotiable prerequisites of the adult life, the life of the farm, the raid, and the deeply dangerous and the profoundly honor-bound world of the yet. The miniature wooden swords, the tracever, that are found in the boys' graves and the settlement contexts, are not the crude, the hastily carved, or the merely symbolic objects. They are, in many cases, the carefully crafted and the perfectly balanced replicas of the adult weapons, the replicas that allowed the young boy to practice, from the earliest age, the complex and the deeply demanding physical movements of the sword fight, the parry, the thrust, the cut, and the profoundly essential footwork and the balance, the movements that were in the hands of a skilled and the deeply experienced warrior, the movements that were the difference between the life and the death and the chaos, and the deeply intimate violence of the shield wall, a practice that was, in the sagas, the constant and the deeply serious occupation of the young boys, a practice that was, in the eyes of the adults, a necessary and the deeply encouraged preparation for the ultimate and the most the sacred duty of the male, the defense of the family, the honor and the profoundly cherished independence of the yet. The small and the exquisitely carved wooden boats, the tray skip, that are found in the children's contexts across the Viking world, from the Birka to the Dublin, are, in their very nature, the direct and the profoundly functional training tools of the future seaborne raiders, the traders, and the deeply adventurous explorers who would, in the adult life, navigate the vast and the deeply treacherous expanses of the North Sea, the Atlantic, and the Baltic in the sleek and the deadly longships that were the supreme technological and the artistic achievement of the Viking age. The toy boat, which was often fitted with the tiny, and the accurately modeled oars, the mast, and the square-rigged woolen sail, was not a passive, and the merely contemplative object. It was a dynamic, and the deeply educational tool, a tool that taught the young child the fundamental principles of the naval architecture, the water displacement, the wind propulsion, and the deeply intricate art of the steering and the navigation, a tool that was, in the hands of the imaginative, and the deeply curious child, a vessel of the endless, the adventures, the raids, and the profoundly formative, mental simulations of the future, adult life, a tool that was, in the words of the sagas, the leaker, the game, the play, that was the prelude, the preparation, and the deeply serious rehearsal of the veriliker, the reality, the true, and the often, the deeply brutal game of the adult existence. The animal-shaped amulets and the toys, the small, wooden, and the carved bears, the wolves, the horses, the birds, and the deeply mythical dragons that are found in the children's graves are not the merely the decorative or the animistic trinkets. They are, in the deeply pagan and the profoundly symbolic world of the Norse, the educational and the profoundly spiritual tools. The tools that were designed to teach the young child the essential and the deeply complex knowledge of the natural world, the behavior, the habits, and the deeply sacred significance of the animals that were, in the Norse cosmology, the companions, the messengers, and the profoundly potent embodiments of the gods, the spirits, and the deeply mysterious forces of the hammer, the shaped soul, the animal form that was the inalienable, and the deeply personal property of every human being. The child, who played with the wooden wolf, the Ulfr, the sacred, and the deeply feared animal of the Odin, was not merely the amusing himself, he was, in the eyes of his parents, the beginning, and the deeply, reverently, to learn the lore, the mythology, and the profoundly essential, psychological, and the spiritual connection to the wild, the predatory, and the divinely inspired power of the wolf. A power that was, in the Lfnar, the wolf-skin warriors, the ultimate, and the most terrifying expression of the human, and the profoundly Odinic warrior ideal, a power that the child, by his play, was the unconsciously, and the deeply, effectively, internalizing, a process of the psychological conditioning that was, in its very essence, the construction of the Norse, and the profoundly masculine identity, an identity that was, in the words of the Havamal, the identity of the bold and the courageous, and the constantly vigilant man, the man who is ready at every moment to face the death with a smile, and the deeply defiant word. The role of the sagas, the oral, narrative, tradition, and the deeply cultural and the profoundly ethical education of the Viking child was, in the pre-literate and the profoundly pagan society of the North, the central, the essential, and the utterly indispensable pillar of the uphelding, the bringing up, the process of the moral, the social, and the deeply psychological conditioning that transformed the young and the profoundly malleable human being into a fully integrated and the deeply responsible member of the clan, and the thing, the assembly of the free and the legally competent men, a process that was, in its very nature, a process of the storytelling, the memorization, the recitation, and the deeply personal and the profoundly emotional identification with the heroes, the ancestors, and the deeply cherished gods of the Norse pantheon. A process that was, in the long, dark, and the deeply isolating winter nights, the primary and the most effective form of the education, the entertainment, and the profoundly communal bonding of the household, a process that the modern and the deeply literate world has, in large part, the forgotten, but which was, for the Vikings, the very foundation of the cultural and the profoundly human continuity. The Havamal, the poem of the High One, the Odin, which is, in its dense and the profoundly wise stanzas, a collection of the practical, the ethical, and the deeply cynical advice for the daily life, a manual of the survival, the honor, and the profoundly essential art of the moderation, the Jafnir, the balance, the fair measure, that was the central, and the most the cherished, value of the Norse ethical system was, in the oral tradition, a text that was learned by the young from the lips of their parents and their grandparents, a text that was the memorized, the recited, and the deeply internalized, a text that was, in its very essence, the distilled, and the profoundly pragmatic wisdom of the ancestors, a wisdom that was, for the child, the guide, the companion, and the deeply comforting, and the profoundly demanding voice of the past, a voice that was, in the quiet and the deeply reflective moments of the daily life, a constant, and the deeply personal presence, a presence that was, in the words of the poem itself, the jester, the guest, the stranger, who comes to the door, and who must be treated with the caution, the respect, and the deeply practical hospitality, a presence that was, for the Norse child, the eternal, and the profoundly formative teacher. The sagas of the Icelanders, the Islandingasogur, the great prose narratives of the settlement, the family, the feud, and the profoundly tragic and the deeply heroic lives of the first generations of the Iceland were, in the later medieval period, the written and the deeply literary expressions of this same ancient and the deeply oral tradition, a tradition that, in the oral form, was the central and the most cherished component of the Viking Age cultural and the profoundly educational system, a system that was, in its very nature, a system of the narrative, the phrasen, the story, the tale, the saga, a story that was the vehicle, the carrier, and the profoundly effective transmitter of the entire, complex, and the deeply integrated body of the Norse knowledge, the history, the genealogy, the law, the religion, the ethics, and the deeply practical skills of the survival, a story that was, for the child, the window, the mirror, and the profoundly formative model of the adult life, a life that was, in the sagas, a life of the courage, the honor, the violence, the tragedy, the love, the loss, and the deeply enduring, and the profoundly human struggle against the inexorable, and the utterly indifferent forces of the fate, the orlog, the primal law of the world, a law that was, in the sagas, as in the life, the ultimate and the most powerful force, a force that the child, by the listening, the memorizing, and the deeply emotional engagement with the sagas, was the beginning, and the profoundly to understand, to accept, and to the deeply internalize as the fundamental and the non-negotiable condition of his own and his family's existence. The runes, the runner, the ancient, and the deeply sacred system of the writing, the divination, and the magic that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly pagan world, the gift of the Odin, the god of the wisdom, the ecstasy, and the sacrifice were, in the educational, and the deeply esoteric dimension of the Viking childhood, a knowledge that was, in all the probability, the reserved for the few, the talented, the initiated, and the profoundly dedicated, the young, who were, by the signs, the omens, or the deeply personal inclination, the destined for the role of the gwa, the priest, the lugskummer, the law speaker, or the skald, the poet, a role that was, in the Viking Age, the role that was the most revered, the most powerful, and the most deeply mysterious of all the social and the sacred functions, a role that was the bridge, the link, and the profoundly essential communicator between the world of the living, the dead, and the gods, a role that the child, who was the chosen, and the deeply trained in the secret, and the profoundly potent lore of the runes, was the beginning, and the deeply, reverently, to assume. The runes, which were the carved on the wood, the bone, the stone, and the metal, were not, in the Norse understanding, a passive, or the merely practical system of the communication. They were, in their very essence, a magical and the profoundly powerful technology, a technology that could, in the hands of the skilled and the deeply knowledgeable practitioner, the influence, the bind, the heal, the protect, and the utterly destroy, a technology that was, in the Havamal, the Galdr, the spells, the charms, the incantations, that the Odin learned in the great shamanic initiation of the hanging on the world tree, the Yggdrasil, a technology that the child, who was the initiated and the deeply trained in the runes was the beginning, and the profoundly to wield a technology that was, in its very nature, the technology of the Jafnir, the balance, the fair measure, the just, and the precisely calculated intervention in the cosmic, and the social order, an intervention that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the essential, and the most the sacred, duty of the human community, a duty that the child, by his patient, and the deeply intensive study of the runes, was the beginning, and the profoundly to fulfill. The psychological, and the deeply emotional, conditioning of the Viking child, the subtle, and the profoundly effective process of the inculcation of the stoic, the fatalistic, the fiercely independent, and the deeply aggressive mindset that was the hallmark, and the most the terrifying feature of the Norse adult personality, was, in the upheldie, the bringing up, the central, the essential, and the utterly all-encompassing objective, an objective that was, in the harsh and the deeply unforgiving world of the North, the objective that was the only, and the most the reliable, guarantee of the survival, the success, and the profoundly cherished honor of the individual, the family, and the yet, an objective that was pursued by the parents and the community, with a relentless, a patient, and a deeply intentional intensity, an intensity that was, in the modern, and the deeply psychologically informed perspective, a form of the ancient, and the profoundly effective cognitive behavioral therapy, a therapy that was designed to extinguish, to eradicate, and to replace the instinctive and the deeply human responses of the fear, the grief, the self-pity, and the passive dependency, with the cultivated and the deeply ingrained habits of the courage, the endurance, the self-reliance, and the profoundly aggressive assertion of the personal and the familial will. The Havamal, the manual of the Norse, and the profoundly pragmatic wisdom is saturated on every page with this intensely stoic and the deeply individualistic ethic, an ethic that the child, from the earliest age, was the constantly and the deeply exposed to in the form of the proverbs, the sayings, the stories, and the profoundly personal examples of the adults, an ethic that was, in its very essence, an ethic of the Jafnir, the balance, the fair measure, the avoidance of the extremes, the excesses, and the deeply dangerous passions, an ethic that was, in the words of the poem, the ethic of the wise, the moderate, and the constantly vigilant man, the man who eats his meal and drinks his ale with the caution and the deeply measured enjoyment, the man who never the overindulges, the never the oversleeps, and the never the overtrusts, the stranger, the friend, or the even the brother, the man who is, at all the times, the master of his own, his deeply guarded, and the profoundly autonomous self. The famous, and the deeply chilling episodes of the saga literature, in which the young children, the boys and the girls of the tender age, are portrayed as the performing, with a calm, a stoic, and a deeply unnerving composure, the acts of the extreme, and the profoundly violent vengeance, a vengeance that is, in the sagas deeply moral, and the profoundly pagan code, the sacred, and the non-negotiable duty of the clan, are not, as the modern, and the deeply horrified reader might suppose, the fanciful, the exaggerated, or the merely literary inventions of the later Christian, and the deeply moralizing authors. They are, in the true, and the profoundly historical context, the direct, and the deeply faithful reflections of the psychological, and the profoundly effective conditioning that the Viking child underwent from the earliest age. A conditioning that was, in its very nature, a conditioning that was designed to produce, in the young, the capacity for the instant, and the utterly unhesitating violence, a violence that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly honor-bound world, the ultimate, and the most necessary expression of the loyalty, the courage, and the deeply cherished identity of the individual and the family. The Egil saga, which we have already cited, provides the most famous, and the most deeply shocking example of this precocious, and the profoundly conditioned violence in the story of the young Egil, who, at the age of 7, and after being cheated, in a game of the ball, by an older, and the deeply bullying boy the Grim, the son of the Heg, immediately, and without any hesitation. They drove an axe into the Grim's skull, a killing that was, in the sagas, deeply admiring, and the profoundly approving narrative, the first, and the most glorious demonstration of the Egilson born, and the deeply sacred Hamingja, his luck, his warrior spirit, his destiny as the greatest, and the most afeared, of the Icelandic warrior poets, a killing that was, in the eyes of the saga's medieval Icelandic audience, the act not of a monstrous, and the profoundly disturbed child, but of a hero, a champion, and of the deeply admirable, and of the fully justified avenger of his own personal honor. The parallel, and the equally demanding, conditioning of the young Viking girl was, in its essence, a conditioning that was designed to cultivate, in the future, Husfrida, the mistress of the house, the qualities of the stoic endurance, the fierce, and the deeply protective loyalty to the family, the sharp, and the profoundly pragmatic intelligence, and the utterly unwavering sense of the personal. And the female authority, the authority that was, in the Norse, legal and the economic system, the sole, and the deeply protected right of the wife and the mother, a right that was, as we have seen, the enshrined in the Gulathing law and the Gragas, a right that the young girl, by the observation, the imitation, and the deeply personal experience of the daily life, was the beginning, and the profoundly to absorb, to understand, and to the deeply internalize, as the fundamental and the non-negotiable condition of her own future, and the profoundly powerful identity. The saga of the Laxdæla, the great, tragic, and the deeply female-centered narrative of the Gernasvarsdottir, provides the most vivid and the most psychologically complex portrait of this female psychological conditioning, a conditioning that was, in the Gurnes life, a conditioning that produced a woman of the immense, the autonomous, and the deeply formidable personal power, a power that was, in its very nature, a power that was the equal, and the often the superior, of any of the male, and the deeply violent power of her father, her husband, and her lovers, a power that was, in the sagas deeply moral, and the profoundly tragic vision, a power that was, in the end, the source of the immense, the suffering, the destruction, and the deeply poignant loneliness of the heroine, a heroine who was, in the saga's final, and the most haunting image, the old, the blind, and the deeply solitary woman, who, when asked by her son which of her husbands she had loved the most, gave the famous, and the profoundly enigmatic answer, "I was the worst to the one I loved the most." An answer that is, in its quiet, and the deeply devastating power, the ultimate, and the most the unforgettable expression of the female, psychological, and the profoundly human complexity of the Viking age. The physical, and the deeply environmental challenges that the Viking child had to endure, and to the master, were, in their very nature, the challenges that were, in the modern, and the deeply comfortable world, the utterly, the unimaginable, a regime of the exposure, the cold, the hunger, the physical exhaustion, and the constant, and the deeply present danger of the accident, the disease, and the sudden, and the profoundly anonymous death that was, for the Norse, the normal, the expected, and the deeply respected condition of the human existence, a condition that was, in the words of the Havamo, the condition of the VTR, the winter, the great, the primal, and the eternally returning force of the darkness, the cold, and the death, a force that the child, from the earliest age, was the taught, and the deeply conditioned to face, with the stoic, the defiant, and the profoundly uncomplaining courage, a courage that was, in the Norse, and the deeply pagan worldview, the only, and the most the sacred, response to the inexorable, and the utterly indifferent power of the Norns, the goddesses of the fate, a power that was, in its very nature, a power that was the beyond the human control, the appeal, or the slightest possibility of the mitigation, a power that the child, by the daily, and the deeply personal experience of the cold, the hunger, and the pain, was the beginning, and the profoundly to understand, to accept, and to the deeply internalize as the fundamental and the non-negotiable reality of the life. The long, dark, and the deeply isolating winter of the north, the Skamdeji, the short days, the period of the months when the sun barely, and the fleetingly, appeared above the horizon, and when the entire world of the fjord and the farm was shrouded in the deep, the silent, and the profoundly oppressive blanket of the snow and the ice, was, for the Viking child, the supreme, and the most formative test of the physical, the psychological, and the deeply communal endurance. A test that was, in its very nature, a test that was shared by the entire household, the family, the servants, and the slaves, the huddled together in the dark, the smoky, and the deeply confined space of the longhouse, a space that was, in the winter, the entire world, a world of the dim, flickering, and of the constantly hungry fire, the reeking, and the deeply animal warmth of the cattle, the sheep, and the horses, who were stalled in the byre at the lower end of the hall, and the constant, and the deeply repetitive labor of the women, the spinning, the weaving, the sewing, and the mending, the labor that was, in the winter, the primary, and the most essential occupation of the female household, a labor that the child, from the earliest age, was the expected, and the deeply necessary, to assist, to learn, and to the gradually master, a labor that was, in the quiet, and the deeply meditative rhythm of the spindle and the loom, the rhythm that was the heartbeat, and the profoundly comforting pulse of the winter, the rhythm that was, for the child, the connection to the mother, the ancestors, and the eternal, and the deeply female power of the Norns, the rhythm that was, in the dark, and the profoundly silent void of the Arctic winter, the only, and the most sacred, assurance of the continuity, the life, and the deeply cherished hope of the return of the sun, the soul, the goddess, the beautiful, and the profoundly beloved source of the light, the warmth, and the life, whose return, at the Jol, the Yule, the winter solstice, was the occasion of the greatest, and the most joyful, festival of the pagan year, the festival that was, for the child, the explosion of the light, the food, the gifts, and the deeply sacred celebration of the victory of the life over the death, a victory that was, in the child's own, and the deeply personal experience, the victory of the survival, the endurance, and the profoundly cherished hope. The physical training of the child in the skills of the winter survival, the skiing, the skafer, the ice skating, the isleaker, and the hunting, and the trapping of the fur-bearing animals in the deep, and the profoundly silent forest, was, in the northernmost, and the most isolated regions of the Norway, the Sweden, and the Iceland, the essential, and the often, the life-saving, component of the Upeldi. A component that was, in its very nature, a component that was the direct and the deeply practical application of the stoic, the endurance, the skill, and the profoundly intimate knowledge of the natural world, a knowledge that was, in the hands of the experienced, and the deeply respected hunter and the trapper, the knowledge that was the difference between the plenty and the starvation, the warmth and the freezing, the life and the death, a knowledge that the child, who was the privileged, and the deeply eager, to accompany his father, his uncle, or his older brother, into the silent, and the deeply sacred wilderness of the winter, was the beginning, and the profoundly, to acquire, a knowledge that was, in the words of the sagas, the ver, the hunt, the sacred, and the profoundly necessary art of the taking of the animal, life, an art that was, in the pagan, and the deeply animistic worldview, a ritual, a sacrifice, and of the deeply respectful negotiation with the spirits, the Vader of the land, the forest, and the animals, a negotiation that the child, by the observation, the imitation, and the deeply personal experience of the hunt, was the beginning, and the profoundly to understand, and to the deeply revere. The transition from the child to the adult, the great, and the profoundly traumatic rupture of the initiation, the Vigslu, the Mandomer, the coming of age, was, in the Viking Age, the Scandinavia, not the gradual, the extended, and the deeply psychological process that is the familiar to the modern, and the profoundly different societies of the West, but a sudden, a violent, and the often, the deeply terrifying ritual, a ritual that was, in its very nature, a ritual of the death and the rebirth, a ritual in which the child, the born, the dependent, the protected, the sexually undifferentiated, and the legally incompetent being was the symbolically, and the often, the physically destroyed, and the new, the adult, the mar, the kona, the fully responsible, the legally competent, and the deeply gendered member of the et, the thing, and the community of the gods and the ancestors, was the created, a creation that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the essential, and the non-negotiable, prerequisite for the assumption of the full, the weight, the duties, and the profoundly cherished rights of the adult life, the life of the marriage, the warfare, the trade, the property ownership, and the deeply personal, and the familial honor, an honor that was, in the Viking age, the ultimate, and the most the sacred value, a value that was, in the absence of the formal, and the legally recognized initiation, the utterly, and the permanently inaccessible to the child, the adolescent, and the deeply frustrated, and the profoundly dangerous young man or woman who was, in the limbo, the milli-stig, the between stage of the post-childhood and the pre-adulthood, a limbo that was, in the Norse society, a state of the immense, the vulnerability, the powerlessness, and the deeply explosive potential for the violence, the rebellion, and the profoundly destabilizing breach of the social and the cosmic order. The specific age of the initiation varied according to the region, the social class, and the individual circumstances, but the archaeological, the legal, and the saga evidence suggests that for the vast majority of the Norse children, the transition was the expected, and the legally recognized, to occur around the age of the 12, the age that was in the Gulathing law and the Frostathing law, the age of the mandem, the legal majority, the age at which the boy could attend and participate in the thing, the assembly, the age at which the girl could be the legally married, and assume the full and the deeply demanding responsibilities of the husfrija, the mistress of the house, an age that was, in the pre-modern, and the deeply harsh conditions of the Viking age, the age that was the biological, and the profoundly practical equivalent of the modern, and the much but later onset of the legal, and the social adulthood. The initiation, for the boy, was often a test of the courage, the physical endurance, the skill, and the profoundly sacred hamingja, a test that could take the form of a solo hunting expedition, a raid on a neighboring and the hostile clan, a journey to a distant and the deeply dangerous place, or a formal and the publicly witnessed combat, a home ganga, a duel against a rival, or a designated and the deeply formidable opponent, a test that was, in its very nature, a test that was the designed and the profoundly intentional to bring the boy to the brink of the death, the annihilation, and the utter dissolution of the self, a brink that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the only and the most the effective gateway to the adult and the profoundly sacred state of the warrior, the drengr, the Viking, the man whose spirit, the hammer, had been the permanently and the irrevocably transformed by the ordeal, the sacrifice, and the deeply personal encounter with the divine, the demonic, and the profoundly mysterious forces of the Odin, the god of the initiation, the gallows, and the sacred warrior death. The initiation of the girl, which was the less the publicly dramatic, but the equally the profound, and the deeply transformative process, was, in its essence, a process of the seclusion, the instruction, the ritual purification, and the final, and the profoundly symbolic emergence into the full, and the deeply sacred power of the female, the kona, the wife, the mother, and the priestess of the household, a process that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly female-centered religion, a process that was under the direct patronage and the guidance of the goddess Freya, the mistress of the love, the fertility, the magic, and the death, and the Norns, the weavers of the fate, the cosmic, and the eternally powerful female beings who were the ultimate, and the most the sacred, models and the archetypes of the earthly, and the profoundly powerful Husfrigr. The girl, who was, at the onset of the puberty, the menstruation, the moment of the immense, and the deeply ambivalent power and the danger was the often the secluded, in a special hut or a chamber, away from the main household, a seclusion that was, in its very nature, a ritual of the death and the rebirth, a period of the darkness, the silence, and the deeply intense instruction from the older women of the family, the instruction in the secret, and the profoundly female lore. The sexual, the reproductive, the medicinal, and the magical knowledge, the knowledge that was the exclusive and the deeply guarded property of the female lineage, a knowledge that was in the hands of the initiated, and the profoundly powerful Husfrija, a knowledge that was the essential and the irreplaceable foundation of the female economic, social, and the deeply sacred authority. A authority that the young girl, by her successful and the profoundly transformative passage through the initiation, was the now, the fully, and the permanently entitled, and the deeply obligated to wield. The physical, and the deeply brutal reality of the child mortality, the constant, and the profoundly traumatic presence of the death of the young, was, in the Viking Age, the Scandinavia, the central, and the most the defining factor of the parental and the communal experience, a factor that shaped, in the most the fundamental, and the profoundly indelible way, the emotional, the psychological, and the deeply cultural responses of the Norse to the children, the childhood, and the profoundly fragile and the precious nature of the human life. The infant and the child mortality rate, which was, as we have noted, in the range of the 30 to the 50%, was a rate that was, in its very magnitude, a rate that was the constant and the deeply intimate companion of every family, a rate that meant that the vast majority of the parents, at some point in their lives, experienced the devastating and the profoundly heartbreaking loss of a child. A loss that was, in the pre-modern and the deeply pagan world, a loss that was the common, the expected, and the deeply shared human experience, but a loss that was, for the individual parent, the loss that was the singular, the unique, and the utterly irreplaceable, personal catastrophe, a catastrophe that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly fatalistic worldview, a catastrophe that was the work of the Norns, the Orlug, the inscrutable, and the eternally just decree of the fate, a decree that was, in the eyes of the pagans, the beyond the human comprehension, the appeal, or the slightest possibility of the mitigation, a decree that was to be the accepted, with the stoic, the silent, and the deeply defiant courage, a courage that was, in the words of the Havamal, the courage of the Sonar Mizsur, the loss of the son, the bitterest of the losses, the loss that no man can the truly the comfort but the self. The archaeological and the deeply poignant evidence of the child burials, the small and the often the elaborately furnished graves that are found in the cemeteries of the Burka, the Kopang, and the other major Viking Age sites is, in its very nature, the direct and the profoundly moving material testimony to the immense, the emotional, and the deeply personal investment that the Norse parents, despite the harsh and the profoundly fatalistic dictates of their culture, placed in the survival, the well-being, and the deeply hoped-for afterlife of their deceased children, an investment that was, in the pagan and the profoundly animistic belief system, a necessary and the deeply effective provision for the child's journey to the realm of the Hel, the goddess of the death, a journey that was, in the Norse cosmos, a journey that was the perilous, the dark, and the deeply lonely path to the Heljar grinder, the gates of hell, the cold, the misty, and the profoundly silent realm of the dead, a realm that was, in the Voluspa, the seeress's prophecy, the place where the wicked, the oath breakers, and the murderers were the destined to suffer, and where the dragon, the Nhgr, the corpse tearer, the nod, the eternally on the roots of the world tree, a realm that the child, who was the innocent and the deeply unprepared for the perils of the afterlife, was the desperately in the need of the provision, the protection, and the deeply loving care of the parents, a care that was, in the grave goods, the miniature weapons, the tools, the amulets, and the deeply personal jewelry, the provision that was the intended, to equip, to arm, and to comfort the child, on the long, and the deeply, terrifying, journey to the unknown. The practice of the exposure of the unwanted, infants, the boriniuti, the carrying out, to die of the cold and the hunger on the barren, hillside, a practice that was, in the pre-Christian, and the deeply, pagan, Scandinavia, illegal, and the socially, accepted, method of the family, planning, the population, control, and the deeply, brutal, but the necessary, elimination of the weak, the deformed. And the profoundly, unaffordable, extra mouths, was, in the modern, and the deeply horrified perspective, the most shocking, and the most incomprehensible, aspect of the Viking childhood, an aspect that is, in its very nature, a stark, and a deeply disturbing reminder of the immense, and the utterly alien, gulf that separates the modern, Western, and the deeply humanitarian values from the harsh, and the profoundly pragmatic calculus of the survival that governed the lives of the early medieval, and the deeply pagan North. The Gulathing law, which was compiled in the 11th and the 12th centuries, but which preserves, in its dense, and the deeply archaic, legal formulations, the customs of the earlier, and the profoundly pagan period, explicitly, and the matter-of-factly, acknowledges the right of the father, the husbandi, to decide the fate of the newborn, a right that was, in the law, the qualified only by the requirement that the child was to be examined by the witnesses, and that the exposure was to be conducted before the child had tasted the food, the milk, or the water, a requirement that was, in the eyes of the law, the safeguard against the killing of a child that had been formally, and the legally, accepted, into the family, a safeguard that was, in the practice, the thin, and the deeply fragile barrier against the abuse, the cruelty, and the profoundly tragic, and the deeply heartbreaking exercise of the absolute, and the utterly unchallengeable paternal power, a power that was, in the cold, and the deeply unforgiving world of the Viking Age, the power that was the essential, and the non-negotiable condition of the survival of the family, the clan, and the entire, and the profoundly interdependent community. The role of the extended family, the clan, and the deeply communal network of the kin, the neighbors, and the profoundly interdependent members of the felag, the fellowship, in the upbringing, the training, and the deeply collective protection of the Viking child was, in the pre-state, and the profoundly decentralized society of the North, the absolute, the essential, and the utterly indispensable factor, a factor that was, in its very nature, a factor that was the direct, and the profoundly functional reflection of the fundamental Norse principle of the Jafnir, the balance, the fair measure, the mutual, and the deeply reciprocal obligation, the obligation that was, in the words of the Havamal, the Venata, the friendship, the bond, the alliance, the obligation that was the constant, and the deeply demanding exchange of the gifts, the favors, and the loyalty, the obligation that was the very fabric, and the profoundly resilient structure of the Norse social, and the profoundly pagan order, an order that was, in the absence of the centralized state, the professional police, or the standing army, the only, and the most reliable guarantee of the individual, and the family security, a security that the child, from the earliest age, was taught, and the deeply conditioned, to recognize, to respect, and to the utterly depend upon, as the primary, and the most sacred source of the protection, the support, and the profoundly cherished identity, an identity that was, in the Norse world, the identity that was not the individual, the autonomous, and the deeply isolated self of the modern Western culture, but the self that was the inextricably, the permanently, and the profoundly embedded in the complex, and the eternally demanding web of the felag, and the community of the living, the dead, and the gods. The FSTBRR, the foster brotherhood, the ancient, and the deeply sacred institution of the fosterin, the fosterage, was, in the Viking Age, the Scandinavia, the most powerful, and the most widely practiced expression of this communal, and the profoundly interdependent principle, a principle that was, in its very nature, a principle of the exchange, the alliance, and the deeply strategic bonding, a bonding that was the created, and the profoundly strengthened by the sending of the child, the boy or the girl, to be the raised, the trained, and the deeply educated, in the household of a neighbor, a friend, a chieftain, or the deeply respected, and the profoundly powerful Bondi, a household that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly personal world, the household that was the not a remote, the impersonal, or the alien institution, but the household that was, in the eyes of the child, the second, the adoptive, and the deeply beloved home. A home that the child, by the act of the fosterage, was the legally, and the profoundly, emotionally, bound to the foster parents, the foster siblings, and the entire, head of the host, a bond that was, in the law and the custom, the bond that was the equal, and the often, the superior, in its strength, its loyalty, and its the deeply, lasting, consequence, to the bond of the blood, a bond that was, in the sagas, the bond that was the source of the sum of the greatest, and the most the tragic, of the Icelandic, and the Norwegian, family dramas, the dramas that were the driven by the terrible, and the profoundly, irresolvable, conflicts of the loyalty, the duty, and the deeply personal, love, that the fosterage, by its very nature was the intended, to create. The daily, and the profoundly practical, life of the foster child, the fostree or the fostra, was, in its essence, a life that was the same as the life of the biological child, a life of the work, the training, the play, and the deeply personal and the emotional integration into the new household, an integration that was, in the successful and the deeply harmonious cases, an integration that was the complete and the profoundly satisfying, an integration that provided the child, the parents, and the entire community with the immense and the deeply cherished benefits of the expanded network of the kin, the allies, and the profoundly reliable mutual defenders, a network that was, in the violent and the deeply unpredictable world of the Viking Age, the network that was the essential and the often the life-saving resource, a resource that the child, by his participation in the fosterage, was the beginning, and the profoundly to learn, to appreciate, and to the deeply internalize as the fundamental and the non-negotiable principle of the social and the political survival. The Egil saga, which we have already cited, provides a vivid and the deeply dramatic example of the fosterage in the story of the young Egil, who, after his first and the deeply shocking killing of the Grimm, is sent by his father, the Skalagrimmer, to be the fostered by a neighbor, the Rolfer, a fosterage that is, in the saga's narrative, a period of the intense and the deeply formative training, the bonding, and the profoundly important political and the social preparation for the Egil's future, and the deeply spectacular career as the warrior, the poet, and the profoundly feared and the deeply admired champion of the Et. The comparative and the deeply illuminating perspective of the early medieval European childhood, the childhood of the Anglo-Saxon, the Frankish, the Irish, and the Slavic societies reveals, with a striking and a deeply instructive clarity, that the Viking Age, Norse system of the uphelding, the bringing up, was, in its harshness, its intensity, and its the deeply pragmatic focus on the early and the profoundly responsible participation in the adult world of the work and the violence, a system that was, in many respects, the extreme and the most demanding of all the contemporary European models, but a system that was, in its very essence, a system that was the direct and the profoundly logical response to the specific and the deeply unforgiving environmental, social, and the political conditions of the North, the conditions that were, in the early medieval Europe, the uniquely, the challenging, and the most formative of the human character, the character that was, in the words of the sagas, the hard, the resilient, the enduring, the character that was the product and the most prized possession of the Norse and the profoundly pagan culture, a culture that was, in the final and the most decisive analysis, a culture that was the forged in the ice, the iron, and the utterly unrelenting fire of the northern, and the profoundly human will. The Anglo-Saxon and the Frankish societies, which were, in the 9th and the 10th centuries, the primary, the targets, and the deeply traumatized victims of the Viking raids, possessed, in their own, and the profoundly Christian traditions, a very different, and the deeply contrasting model of the childhood, a model that was, in its official, and the clerical, ideology, a model that was influenced by the Augustinian doctrine of the original sin, the infant baptism, and the deeply paternalistic, and the profoundly authoritarian structure of the patriarchal family, a structure that was, in the law and the custom, the structure that was the absolute, and the deeply unchallengeable authority of the father, the paterfamilias, but a structure that was, in the practice, the often the tempered by the stronger, and the more the legally protected position of the Christian wife and the mother, the materfamilias, and by the deeply influential and the profoundly pervasive role of the church, the monastery, and the emerging network of the parish schools, the schools that were, in the Carolingian and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the primary and the most effective instruments of the Christianization, the education, and the deeply social and the cultural transformation of the young, a transformation that was, in its very nature, a transformation that was the antithesis and the ultimate negation of the pagan and the profoundly secular and the deeply violent values of the Viking North. The Anglo-Saxon child, who was, from the age of the 7 or the 8, the obligated by the law and the custom to attend the parish school or the monastery school to learn the Latin, the grammar, the rhetoric, the scripture, and the deeply essential arts of the computus, the calendar, and the chant, was, in the eyes of the Norse, the profoundly alien and the deeply contemptible figure. A figure of the softness, the passivity, the deeply unmartial, and the profoundly submissive character, the Bachmar, the bookman, the clerk, the priest, the figure that was, in the pagan, and the deeply masculine ethos of the North, the antithesis, and the ultimate, the despised negation of the true, and the profoundly cherished ideal of the warrior, the Dranger, the Viking, the man whose knowledge was not the Latin, the scripture, or the chant, but the knowledge of the sword, the sea, the forest, and the deeply sacred wisdom of the Havamal. The Odin and the ancestors, a wisdom that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly proud estimation, the infinitely the superior, and the more the useful, to the life, the survival, and the deeply cherished honor of the free, and the fiercely independent man. The Irish and the Slavic societies, which were, in the Viking Age, the complex and the deeply contested frontier zones of the Norse expansion, the zones of the intense, the violent, and the profoundly transformative cultural exchange, the intermarriage, and the gradual, and the deeply syncretic fusion of the pagan, the Christian, the Norse, the Celtic, and the Slavic traditions presented, in their own and the deeply varied models of the childhood, a fascinating and a deeply instructive range of the alternatives, and the profoundly complex mixtures of the indigenous and the imported practices, a range that is, in the archaeological and the historical record, the still, the largely, the unexplored, and the deeply promising field of the research, a field that is, in the coming years, the certain to yield the new and the profoundly illuminating insights into the nature, the diversity, and the deeply human commonalities of the childhood in the early medieval world. The Irish, the fosterage, which was, in the pre-Norse, and the deeply ancient Gaelic society, the central, and the most cherished institution of the child-rearing, the education, and the profoundly political alliance-building, was, in its very nature, a system that was remarkably similar to the Norse fostrin, a similarity that was, in all the probability, the product not of the direct influence, but of the deep, the structural, and the profoundly logical convergence of the two fragmented and the deeply honor-bound warrior societies, a convergence that was, in the Viking Age, Ireland, the foundation, and the deeply complex, and the often the violent matrix of the Norse Gaelic, cultural, and the profoundly hybrid identity, an identity that was, in the persons of the Gaul Gaedhil, the foreign Gaels, the descendants of the mixed marriages, and the deeply intertwined lineages, the permanent, and the profoundly enduring legacy of the meeting. The clash, and the ultimate, and the deeply human fusion of the two, and the profoundly different worlds. The ultimate, and the most the enduring, legacy of the Viking childhood, the uphelding, the bringing up, the long, harsh, and the deeply intentional process of the training, the conditioning, and the profoundly transformative initiation that forged the resilient, the independent, the fiercely proud, and the profoundly violent human beings of the Viking Age, is a legacy that is, in the modern and the profoundly different world, a legacy that is the deeply ambivalent, the complex, and the profoundly challenging to assess, a legacy that is, in its very nature, a legacy that is the simultaneously, the admirable, and the deeply disturbing, the inspiring, and the profoundly cautionary, the testament to the immense, and the profoundly human capacity for the survival, the adaptation, and the deeply creative response to the most the extreme, and the most the unforgiving of the environmental, and the historical circumstances, and the warning, the dark, and the deeply sobering reminder of the terrible, and the profoundly destructive cost of the absolute, and the uncompromising commitment to the code of the honor, the violence, and the deeply self-consuming glory, a cost that was, in the Viking Age, the cost that was paid, not only by the countless, the anonymous, and the deeply forgotten victims of the raids, the slaughter, and the enslavement, but by the Norse themselves, the men, the women, and the profoundly resilient and the deeply tragic children who were, in the words of the sagas, the born, the children, the hope, and the deeply cherished future of the yet. The children who, in the dark, the silent, and the profoundly unyielding grip of the northern winter, the cold, the hunger, and the ever-present, the shadow of the death, learned, at the knees of their mothers and the sides of their fathers, the arts, the skills, and the deeply sacred, and the profoundly terrifying code of the survival, a code that was, in the end, the only, and the most the powerful, inheritance that the pagan, and the profoundly doomed world of the North could bestow upon the generations that would, in the coming centuries, the Christianized, the civilized, and the profoundly transformed, but that would never be entirely lose the memory, the echo, and the deeply ingrained habit of the courage, the endurance, and the fiercely independent spirit that was the forged in the ice, the iron, and the utterly unrelenting fire of the Viking Age. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video. The specific and the deeply gendered nature of the skills training that the Viking child received, the rigorous and the profoundly intentional division of the labor, the knowledge, and the deeply cherished identity between the boys and the girls was, in the uphelding, the bringing up, the most the fundamental, and the most the enduring, structural principle, a principle that was, in its very essence, a principle that was the direct, and the profoundly faithful reflection of the cosmic, and the deeply sacred order of the Norse, and the profoundly pagan world, a world in which the gods themselves, the Odin, the Thor, the Freyr, and the Freya, were the gendered, the differentiated, and the eternally complementary beings, a world in which the human society, the et, the thing, and the felag, were the organized, and the profoundly justified, according to the same, and the deeply immutable principle of the Jafnir, the balance, the fair measure, the mutual, and the deeply respectful complementarity of the male and the female, a complementarity that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the essential and the non-negotiable condition of the survival, the prosperity, and the profoundly cherished harmony of the individual, the family, and the cosmos, a harmony that the child, from the earliest age, was the trained and the deeply conditioned to understand, to accept, and to the utterly internalize as the fundamental and the most the sacred law of the life. The training of the boy, the future, Bondi, the farmer, the warrior, the Vikinger, the Dranger, the young, and the profoundly ambitious man was, in its very nature, a training that was designed to cultivate, in him, the qualities of the strength, the courage, the aggression, the independence, the deeply competitive spirit, and the profoundly stoic endurance, the qualities that were, in the Norse, and the profoundly masculine ideal, the qualities that were the essential, and the non-negotiable prerequisites of the successful, and the deeply honored male life, a life of the external, the public, and the profoundly violent action, a life that was, in the words of the Havamal, the life of the Dranger, the bold, the daring, and the constantly vigilant man, the man who is ready at every moment to face the enemy, the beast, or the storm, with the sword, the axe, and the deeply defiant word, the man who is the master of the sea, the forest, and the battlefield, the man who is the provider, the protector, and the profoundly feared, and the deeply admired champion of the yet, a champion whose every action, thought, and word was the public, the visible, and the eternally recorded by the skalds, the poets, and the memory of the ancestors, a record that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly honor-bound society, the record that was the ultimate, and the most the sacred, judgment of the man's life, a judgment that the boy by his training, his initiation, and his the deeply aspiring dreams, was the constantly, and the profoundly, anxiously, anticipating. The training of the girl, the future, Husfrija, the mistress of the house, the wife, the mother, the weaver, the spinner, the healer, and the deeply powerful, and the profoundly respected center of the domestic, and the female economy, was, in its very nature, a training that was designed to cultivate, in her, the qualities of the patience, the diligence, the intelligence, the deeply practical wisdom, the profoundly fierce, and the protective loyalty to the family, and the utterly unwavering sense of the personal, and the female authority, the authority that was, in the Norse, legal, and the economic system, the sole, and the deeply protected right of the wife and the mother, a right that was, as we have seen, the enshrined in the Gulathing law and the Gragas, a right that was, in its very essence, the right to control, the manage, and to the dispose of the household's most the vital, and the most the economically significant assets, the loom, the wool, the sailcloth, the food, the stores, the dairy, the slaves, and the deeply precious, and the profoundly secret knowledge of the female, industrial, and the magical arts, a knowledge that was, in the hands of the skilled, and the deeply experienced Husfrija, the knowledge that was the essential, and the irreplaceable, foundation of the family's, and the community's survival, a survival that was, in the harsh, and the deeply unforgiving environment of the North, the survival that was, in the final, and the most decisive analysis, the survival that was dependent not on the male and the seaborne adventure, but on the quiet, the patient, and the profoundly underappreciated labor of the female, the domestic, and the deeply sacred hearth, a hearth that the girl, by her training, her initiation, and her the deeply cherished aspiration, was the destined, and the profoundly obligated to inherit, to protect, and to the eternally sustain. The practical, and the deeply hands-on nature of the training, for both the boys and the girls, was, in the Viking Age, the Scandinavia, the primary, and the most the effective, mode of the instruction, a mode that was, in its very essence, a mode that was the direct, and the profoundly functional, expression of the Norse, and the deeply pragmatic, and the profoundly anti-theoretical, and anti-intellectual ethos, an ethos that was, in the words of the Havamal, the ethos of the work. The work, the deed, the action that was the true, and the only, measure of the human worth, the action that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the infinitely, the superior, to the mere, the passive, the contemplative, or the abstract thought, a thought that was, in the pagan, and the profoundly secular culture, the thought that was the suspect, the dangerous, and the deeply associated with the seer, the shamanic, and the profoundly feminine magic, and the Bach, the book, the Christian, and the deeply alien learning of the monks and the priests, a learning that the Norse, in their fierce, and the profoundly, proud, independence, the utterly, and the profoundly, contemptuously, rejected. The boy, who learned to build the ship, the Nor, the ocean-going, merchant vessel, not by the studying the plans, the reading the manual, or the attending the lectures, but by the years of the patient, and the deeply, physical, apprenticeship at the side of his father, his uncle, or the master, shipwright, the skipasmir, the man whose knowledge was stored not in the books, but in the hands, the eyes, and the deeply intuitive, and the profoundly embodied sense of the wood, the grain, the curve, and the deeply hidden strength of the oak, the pine, and the ash, was the boy who was, in the end, the master not of the theory, but of the reality, a reality that was, in the storm-tossed, and the deeply treacherous waters of the North Sea, the reality that was the only, and the most reliable, guarantee of the safety, the success, and the profoundly cherished return to the home. A return that was, for the Viking, the ultimate, and the most sacred goal of the voyage, a goal that the boy, by his patient, and the profoundly physical training, was the destined, and the deeply obligated, to ensure. The girl, who learned to weave the great woolen sail, the segel, the primary, and the only engine of the longship, not by the reading the pattern, the counting the threads, or the following the abstract instructions, but by the years of the patient, and the deeply physical apprenticeship at the side of her mother, her grandmother, or the master weaver, the husfrija, the woman whose knowledge was stored not in the written records but in the hands, the fingers, and the deeply intuitive, and the profoundly embodied sense of the wool, the tension, the twist, and the deeply hidden quality of the yarn, the weave, and the profoundly secret recipe of the fulling, and the greasing, the recipe that was, in the female, and the deeply guarded tradition, the recipe that was the essential, and the irreplaceable, determinant of the sail's strength, its windproofing, and its the ultimately the life-saving durability, a durability that was, for the men who sailed in the great, and the profoundly vulnerable, open boats, the durability that was the difference between the life and the death, the success and the disaster, the return and the eternal, the anonymous, the cold, and the deeply silent grave of the sea, a grave that the girl, by her patient, and the profoundly physical training, was the destined, and the deeply obligated, to prevent, a prevention that was, in the quiet, the domestic, and the deeply unassuming sphere of the longhouse, the female, and the profoundly powerful counterpart of the male, and the deeply violent sphere of the raid, a counterpart that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the equal, the essential, and the utterly complementary expression of the Jafnir, the balance, the fair measure, the cosmic, and the profoundly human order, an order that the child, by his or her training, was the destined, and the profoundly to perpetuate. The role of the oral, and the deeply cultural transmission of the knowledge, the free, the lore, the wisdom, the stories, the laws, the genealogies, and the profoundly sacred poetry, in the upholding of the Viking child was, in the pre-literate, and the profoundly pagan North, the absolute, the essential, and the utterly indispensable component of the education, a component that was, in its very nature, a component that was the direct, and the profoundly functional expression of the Norse, and the deeply communal, and the profoundly mnemonically sophisticated oral culture, a culture that was, in the absence of the writing, the books, and the formal schools, the culture that was the entirely dependent for its survival, its continuity, and its the deeply cherished identity on the trained, the disciplined, and the profoundly capacious memories of the individuals. The Lagsogumen, the law speakers, the gore, the priests, the skald, the poets, and the husfrigir, the mistresses of the house, a culture that was, in its very essence, a culture of the mini, the memory, the mal, the speech, and the HLJ, the listening, a culture that the child, from the earliest age, was the immersed, the trained, and the deeply conditioned to participate in, to preserve, and to the profoundly revere, as the most the sacred, and the most the powerful, of all the human faculties, a faculty that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly animistic. Worldview, a faculty that was the direct, and the deeply personal, connection to the ancestors, the gods, and the profoundly mysterious, and the eternal, powers of the Orlog, the fate, a connection that the child by the patient, and the deeply intensive, training of the memory, the recitation, and the profoundly attentive, listening, was the beginning, and the profoundly, to establish, and to the deeply cherish. The Kvoldvaka, the evening wake, the long, dark, and the deeply intimate hours of the winter night, when the entire household, the family, the servants, the slaves, and the occasional, the visiting guests, the jester, were the gathered around the central hearth fire, the elder, the sacred, and the profoundly life-giving flame, was, in the Viking age, the Scandinavia, the primary, and the most the effective classroom, the theater, and the temple of the oral tradition, a tradition that was, in this deeply communal and the profoundly immersive setting, the transmitted, from the old to the young, the learned to the ignorant, the experienced to the innocent, a transmission that was, in its very nature, a transmission that was the direct, the personal, and the deeply emotional experience, an experience that was, in the flickering, and the deeply hypnotic light of the fire. The smell of the burning birchwood, the taste of the mjr, the mead, and the ol, the ale, and the sound of the human voice, the mal, the sangr, the song, the kviandi, the chant, the recitation of the draper, the long, and the profoundly complex praise poems, and the sogar, the sagas, the stories of the ancestors, the heroes, the gods, and the deeply cherished, and the profoundly tragic past, an experience that was, for the child, the most vivid, the most memorable, and the most formative of all the educational experiences, an experience that was, in the words of the Havamal, the Gamans, the joy, the pleasure, the delight that was the essential, and the most the effective teacher, a teacher that the child by the constant, and the deeply eager participation in the Kvoldvaka, was the beginning, and the profoundly to love, and to the deeply revere. The training of the memory, the mini, was, in the Viking age, the Scandinavia, the systematic, the rigorous, and the deeply demanding discipline, a discipline that was, in its very nature, a discipline that was the essential, and the non-negotiable, prerequisite for the participation in the legal, the political, and the religious life of the community, a community that was, in the absence of the written records, the entirely dependent on the memory of the individuals, the logsogumen, who could recite, from the memory, the entire, complex, and the profoundly detailed body of the law, the log, the damer, the retcher, a body that was, in the Icelandic gragas, the vast, the dense, and the deeply intricate collection of the rules, the procedures, the fines, and the profoundly specific penalties, a collection that was, in its sheer, the magnitude, and its the deeply technical complexity. A collection that was the equal, and the often, the superior, of any of the written, and the professionally compiled legal codes of the contemporary European kingdoms, a collection that the law speaker, the lagskummer, was the required by his office to the recite, from the memory, over the course of the 3 annual sessions of the Alingi, the General Assembly, a feat that was, in the modern, and the deeply forgetful world, the utterly, the unimaginable. A feat that was the product, not of the genetic gift, or the divine inspiration, but of the long, the patient, and the deeply disciplined training that the child, who was the destined for the role of the law speaker, the priest, or the skald, was the beginning, and the profoundly to undergo, from the age of the 7 or the 8, a training that was, in its very essence, a training of the ower, the memorizer, the reciter, the living, and the profoundly revered repository of the sacred, and the profoundly essential knowledge of the community, a knowledge that the child, by his patient, and the deeply intensive study, the repetition, the recitation, and the profoundly attentive listening to the elders, was the beginning, and the profoundly to absorb, to organize, and to the deeply internalize as the fundamental, and the non-negotiable, duty of his future, and the profoundly responsible, adult life. The specific, and the deeply mnemonic techniques that the Norse employed, the kenninger, the poetic periphrases, the heiti, the synonyms, the stef, the refrains, the drakvate, the complex, and the profoundly intricate meter of the skaldic poetry, were, in their very nature, the powerful and the deeply effective tools of the memory, the tools that were the designed, not merely to the decorate, the embellish, or the entertain, but to the encode, the compress, and the profoundly secure the vast, the amounts of the information, the genealogies, the laws, the stories, and the deeply cherished wisdom of the ancestors in the memorable, the rhythmic, and the deeply resonant verbal structures, the structures that were in the hands of the skilled, and the deeply trained skald, the structures that were the almost, the impossible, to the forget, the structures that were in the ears of the child, the structures that were the deeply, the attractive, the hypnotic, and the profoundly educational, a form of the learning that was, in its very essence, the leaker, the game, the play, the artity, the skill, the art that was the most the highly prized, and the most the deeply respected, of all the Norse cultural achievements, an achievement that the child, by his patient, and the deeply enthusiastic participation in the kvolvaka, was the beginning. And the profoundly, to master, a mastery that was, in the eyes of the community, the sign, the proof, and the deeply cherished evidence of the child's intelligence, his memory, his hamingja, his luck, and his the profoundly promising future as a fully and the deeply contributing member of the the thing, and the community of the gods and the ancestors. The physical and the deeply nutritional environment of the Viking childhood, the diet, the health, the disease, and the profoundly resilient and the deeply adaptive physiology of the young, was, in the harsh and the utterly unforgiving conditions of the North, the fundamental and the most the determining factor of the survival, the growth, and the deeply cherished physical and the mental development of the child, a factor that was, in its very nature, a factor that was the direct and the profoundly functional reflection of the Norse, and the deeply pragmatic and the profoundly resourceful economy, an economy that was, in the vast majority of the cases, a subsistence, and the deeply vulnerable economy, an economy that was, at the best of the times, the precarious, and at the worst, the catastrophic balance between the starvation and the plenty. A balance that the child, from the earliest age, was the profoundly and the personally experienced in the cycles of the hunger and the feasting, the Vesla, the cycles that were, in the Norse, and the deeply fatalistic worldview, the cycles that were the direct and the profoundly just expression of the hamingja, the luck, the fortune of the family, and the deeply mysterious and the eternally inscrutable decree of the Norns, the goddesses of the fate, a decree that the child, by the constant and the deeply physical experience of the hunger, the cold, and the utterly exhausting labor, was the beginning, and the profoundly to understand, to accept, and to the deeply internalize as the fundamental and the non-negotiable condition of the human existence, an existence that was, in the words of the Havamal, the likn, the relief, the nausen, the necessity, the rot, the endurance, the struggle that was the eternal, and the most the sacred, duty of the man and the woman, a duty that the child, by his or her training, was the destined, and the profoundly obligated to fulfill. The staple diet of the Viking Age Scandinavia, the food that was the consumed by the vast majority of the population, the free bander, the farmers, the lar, the slaves, and the children, was, in its very nature, a diet that was the simple, the monotonous, and the deeply dependent on the local, the seasonal, and the profoundly variable resources of the farm, the forest, the river, and the sea. A diet that was, in the modern, and the deeply nutritionally informed perspective, a diet that was, in many respects, the surprisingly, the healthy, the balanced, and the richly, the varied, a diet that was the based on the whole grain, porridge, the grouter, the flat bread, the flatbrow, the dairy products, the skyr, the cheese, the butter, the preserved, the dried, the smoked, and the fermented, fish, the herring, the cod, the salmon, the meat of the sheep, the goat, the cattle, the pig, and the wild game, The elk, the reindeer, the deer, the seal, the whale, and the sea. Birds, the eggs, the berries, the nuts, the roots, the herbs, and the deeply essential and the profoundly versatile onion, the lauker, a diet that was, in the long dark, and the deeply challenging winter, the supplemented by the stored, the dried, the salted, and the fermented provisions, the provisions that were in the burr, the storehouse, the law, the barn, the carefully, the managed, and the profoundly anxiously guarded against the rot, the vermin, and the ever present, and the deeply terrifying threat of the exhaustion, the scorch, the scarcity, that could, in the matter of the weeks, transform the prosperous, and the deeply contented farm into the scene of the starvation, the disease, and the profoundly tragic, and the deeply anonymous death, a death that the child, by the constant, and the deeply personal experience of the hunger VTR. The hunger winter, the winter of the famine, was the profoundly, and the personally acquaintance that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly fatalistic, and the deeply stoic culture, the acceptance, the all, the endurance, the patience, the silent, and the deeply defiant, waiting for the return of the sun, the soul, the light, and the life. The archaeological, and the deeply scientific, analysis of the human, skeletal remains from the Viking Age cemeteries, the analysis that has been conducted in the recent decades by the bioarchaeologists, the osteologists, and the profoundly skilled specialists in the isotopes and the ADNA, has provided a direct, and a deeply detailed window into the health, the nutrition, and the profoundly physical stresses of the Viking childhood, a window that has, in many cases, confirmed, and the significantly deepened, the picture that was painted by the sagas and the other written sources, a picture of a childhood that was, in its very nature, a childhood of the intermittent, but the often, the severe, malnutrition, the mager, the wasting, the sulur, the swelling, the signs of the rickets, the scurvy, the anemia, and the other, the deeply debilitating deficiency diseases. The diseases that were the direct, and the profoundly tragic, consequence of the long, dark, and the deeply food-scarce winters, the winters that were, in the northernmost, and the most isolated regions of the Norway, the Iceland, and the Greenland, the winters that were the especially, the cruel, and the profoundly fatal, to the young, the weak, and the deeply vulnerable, the children who were, in the words of the sagas, the born, the children, the hope, and the deeply cherish future of the yet. The children who, in the silent, and the deeply unyielding grip of the hunger VTR, the hunger winter, were the first, and the most deeply pitted to succumb, a succumbing that was, in the eyes of the parents, the community, and the gods, the deeply, the tragic, but the ultimately, the inevitable, and the profoundly just decree of the Norns, the Orlog, the fate, a decree that the surviving, and the deeply resilient children, the AF Kvami, the offspring, the descendants, were the destined, and the profoundly obligated to the honor, the physical, and the deeply robust nature of the surviving Viking children, the children who were, by the combination of the luck, the humingja, the good nutrition, the careful, and the deeply loving care of the parents, and the profoundly resilient constitution, the able to overcome the immense, and the deeply challenging odds of the infant, and the child, mortality, was, in the eyes of the Norse, the direct, and the profoundly visible sign of the divine favor, the gift, the grace, the gypta, the good fortune, the fortune that was the essential, and the non-negotiable qualification for the successful, and the deeply honored adult life, a life that was, in the Viking Age, the life of the physical, the demanding, and the profoundly violent action, a life that the weak, the sickly, the deformed, and the deeply unfortunate, were the incapable of the leading, a life that the child, who was the Agiaf Screamy, the not a monster, the normal, the healthy, the strong, was the destined, and the profoundly obligated to the embrace, with the courage, the determination, and the deeply grateful heart, a heart that was, in the words of the Havamal, the glar, the glad, the cheerful, the joyful, the heart that was the essential, and the most effective weapon against the darkness, the cold, and the ever-present, and the deeply haunting fear of the death. A weapon that the child, by the example, the instruction, and the profoundly loving encouragement of the parents, was the beginning, and the profoundly to develop, to sharpen, and to the deeply cherish, as the most the precious, and the most the enduring, of all the inheritances of the North. The legal, and the deeply formal, status of the Viking child, the rights, the protections, the disabilities, and the profoundly dependent, and the deeply subordinate, position of the young in the complex, and the profoundly hierarchical, structure of the Norse law and the society, was, in the Gulathing law, the Frostathing law, the Gragas, and the other provincial, and the later national codes, a matter of the meticulous, the detailed, and the profoundly pragmatic regulation, a regulation that was, in its very essence, a regulation that was the direct, and the profoundly functional, expression of the fundamental Norse principles of the the clan, the Jafnir, the balance, the fair measure, and the deeply reciprocal obligation, the skilda, the duty, a regulation that was, in the absence of the centralized state, the professional police, or the standing army, the only and the most the reliable guarantee of the child's security, the family's peace, and the community's, the deeply cherished, and the profoundly vulnerable order, an order that the child, from the moment of the nafefesture, the name-giving, and the formal acceptance into the was the legally, the protected, the entitled, and the profoundly obligated to uphold, to respect, and to the deeply cherish, as the sacred, and the eternal foundation of the human, and the cosmic society. A society that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the Migr, the middle yard, the realm of the humans, the realm that was the constantly, the threatened by the forces of the chaos, the Tgar, the outer yard, the realm of the giants, the monsters, and the profoundly hostile, and the deeply alien powers, a realm that the child, by his or her obedience to the law, the log, the damer, the retter, was the destined, and the profoundly obligated, to help to the defend, a defense that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly communal society, the primary, and the most the sacred duty of every free, and the legally competent individual, a duty that the child, by his or her training, was the beginning, and the profoundly to prepare, to assume, and to the deeply revere. The child, the barn, the unmany, the young person was, in the Norse law, the O'Malley, the speechless, the legally incompetent, the person who could not, in his or her own right, the bring a lawsuit, the testify, the swear an oath, the enter into a contract, or the control, the own property, a disability that was, in the modern, and the deeply individualistic perspective, a profound, and a deeply restrictive limitation, but a limitation that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly communal world, a necessary and a deeply protective measure, a measure that was designed to shield the child from the dangers, the complexities, and the profoundly dangerous obligations of the adult, legal, and the political life, a life that was, in the Viking age, the life of the constant, the intense, and the often, the violent, competition, the feud, the vig, the killing, and the deeply demanding, and the profoundly unforgiving pursuit of the honor, the heir, the viring, the respect, a pursuit that the child, who was the under the protection, the vorn, and the authority, the feri of the father, the husbandi, or the legal guardian, the grandi, was the exempt from the participating, a exemption that was, in the eyes of the law, the essential, and the non-negotiable, condition of the child's safety, the education, and the profoundly gradual, and the carefully managed transition to the full, and the deeply responsible, adult status, a transition that was, in the Gulathing law, the specifically, and the meticulously regulated by the provisions for the mandamer, the legal majority, the age of the 12, the age that was, in the law, the moment of the sudden, and the profoundly transformative acquisition of the full, the legal rights, the duties, and the deeply terrifying, and the profoundly empowering responsibilities of the adult. A moment that the child, by his or her training, was the destined, and the profoundly to reach, to accept, and to the deeply cherish. The law, however, the also, the recognized, the certain, limited, rights and the capacities of the child, particularly in the areas of the property, the inheritance, and the deeply personal injury, a recognition that was, in its very nature, a recognition that was the direct and the profoundly functional expression of the deeply pragmatic and the profoundly fair-minded spirit of the Norse legal system, a system that was, in the words of the Gragas, the Jafn log, the equal law. The law that was the applied, the equally, and the justly, to all the free members of the community, regardless of the age, the sex, or the social status. The child, who was the victim of the violence, the injury, or the killing, was the entitled by the law to the mangold, the wergild, the blood price, the compensation that was the paid by the offender and his to the child's family, a compensation that was, in the law, the same, and the often the higher, for the child as for the adult, a provision that was, in the deeply pragmatic and the profoundly economic calculus of the Norse, the essential, and the most the effective deterrent against the violence, the abuse, and the deeply destabilizing feud, a provision that was, in its very nature, a recognition, and of the deeply moving testament to the immense, the emotional, and the profoundly personal value that the Norse parents, despite the harsh and the deeply fatalistic dictates of their culture, placed on the lives, the well-being, and the deeply cherished memory of their children, a value that was, in the law, the translated into the cold and the precisely measured weight of the silver that was the weighed on the portable scale, the scale, by the silvermar, the weigher, the assayer, the profoundly impartial, and the deeply revered auditor of the thing, an auditor whose scale was, in the eyes of the Norse, the ultimate, and the most the sacred instrument of the Jafnir, the balance, the fair measure, the justice, a justice that was, for the child, the victim, the survivor, and the deeply innocent, and the profoundly vulnerable, the only, and the most the reliable protection against the arbitrary, the violent, and the deeply terrifying chaos of the world. The emotional, and the deeply psychological life of the Viking child, the bonds of the love, the affection, the attachment, and the profoundly human need for the security, the comfort, and the deeply personal recognition was, in the harsh and the deeply stoic culture of the North, a dimension of the childhood that was, in the public and the profoundly male-dominated discourse of the sagas, the laws and the skaldic poetry, the often, the occluded, the suppressed, and the deeply hidden, but a dimension that was, in the private, the domestic, and the profoundly female-centered sphere of the longhouse, the sphere of the husfrija, the mother, the grandmother, the nurse, the fostra, the sphere that was, in the words of the Laxdala saga, the sphere of the Ast, the love, the umhigja, the care, the hlija, the warmth, the sphere that was the true, and the most the essential foundation of the child's emotional, and the profoundly human development, a development that was, in the modern, and the deeply psychologically informed perspective, the development that was the critical, and the non-negotiable, prerequisite for the formation of the secure, the resilient, and the profoundly healthy, adult personality, a personality that was, in the Viking Age, the personality that was the necessary, the essential, and the deeply cherished for the survival, the success, and the profoundly communal harmony of the et and the thing, a harmony that the child, by the constant, and the deeply intimate experience of the maternal love, the paternal protection, and the fraternal companionship, was the beginning, and the profoundly to internalize as the fundamental, and the most the sacred, emotional, and the social reality, a reality that was, in the dark, and the deeply silent hours of the winter night, the reality that was the only, and the most the powerful antidote to the fear, the loneliness, and the profoundly haunting presence of the death, the Dawi, the hell, the cold, and the utterly indifferent goddess of the grave. The sagas, for all their stoic, and the deeply heroic exterior, are, in their very essence, the profoundly emotional, and the deeply human narratives, the narratives that are filled with the vivid, and the often, the heartbreaking depictions of the parental love, the familial affection, and the deeply tragic, and the profoundly devastating grief of the loss, a grief that was. In the words of the Havamal, the Sonar Mizsur, the loss of the son, the bitterest of the losses. The loss that no man can the truly, the comfort but the self. A grief that the saga characters, the stoic, and the deeply heroic, men and the women, the often, the express, not in the loud, the demonstrative, or the public, lamentations, but in the quiet, the silent, and the profoundly internalized sorrow, the sorrow that was the channeled, and the deeply transformed into the relentless, and the profoundly destructive pursuit of the vengeance, the heft, the vague, the killing, the pursuit that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly honor-bound society, the only, and the most the sacred, response to the loss, the grief, and the deeply personal, and the familial, violation, a response that the child, by the observation, the imitation, and the deeply personal experience of the loss, was the beginning, and the profoundly, to learn, to understand, and to the deeply internalize as the fundamental, and the non-negotiable, law of the emotional, and the social life, a law that was, in the end, the law that was the source of the greatest, and the most the tragic, of the human dramas, the dramas that were the Islandingasogur, the sagas of the Icelanders, the sagas that were, in the long, dark, and the deeply emotional winter nights, the primary, and the most the powerful form of the emotional, and the profoundly psychological education of the child. An education that was, in its very nature, an education of the heart, the soul, and the deeply cherished and the profoundly complex human spirit. The role of the fostra, the foster mother, the nurse, the female servant, or the slave, who was the assigned by the husfrija to the care, the feeding, and the deeply daily supervision of the young children, was, in the Viking Age, the Scandinavia, a role that was, in the private, and the deeply intimate sphere of the longhouse, a role that was the immensely, the important, and the profoundly influential. A role that was, in many cases, the role that was the primary, and the most. The beloved, source of the emotional warmth, the physical comfort, and the deeply personal security for the child, a role that the sagas, in their occasional, and the deeply poignant references, the vividly illuminate, as a bond of the deep, and the profoundly lasting affection, a bond that was, in the Laxdala saga, the bond between the young Gurn and her fostra. The bond that was the source of the comfort, the wisdom, and the deeply secret, and the profoundly female knowledge, the knowledge that was the transmitted from the old and the deeply experienced woman to the young, and the profoundly aspiring girl, a knowledge that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly patriarchal society, the knowledge that was the essential and the irreplaceable foundation of the female power, the seer, the magic, the lakening, the healing, the spa, the prophecy, a knowledge that the child, by the constant and the deeply intimate companionship of the fostra, was the beginning, and the profoundly to acquire, a acquisition that was, in the eyes of the community, the essential, and the most the sacred preparation for the future, and the profoundly demanding role of the husfrija, the mistress, the mother, and the deeply powerful, and the profoundly revered center of the domestic, and the emotional world, a world that was, in the quiet, and the deeply hidden spaces of the longhouse, the world that was the true, and the most the enduring heart of the Viking Age. The influence of the grandparents, the AFI, the grandfather, and the Amma, the grandmother, on the upholding, the bringing up of the Viking child was, in the multi-generational, and the profoundly extended family structure of the Norse society, the immense, the pervasive, and the deeply cherished, a factor that was, in its very nature, a factor that was the direct, and the profoundly functional expression of the ancient, and the profoundly ancestor-worshipping religious system, a system that was, in the pagan North, the central, and the most the sacred component of the individual, the family, and the communal identity, a system that was, in the daily life, the blot, the sacrifice, the mini, the memorial, toast, the disablat, the sacrifice to the dessert, the female, ancestral spirits, the rituals that the grandparents, who were the living, and the profoundly revered Embodiments of the ancestors were the responsible and the deeply honored to perform, to teach, and to the transmit, to the young, a transmission that was, in the eyes of the child, the most direct, and the most powerful, connection to the past, the foreign the ancient time, the time of the heroes, the gods, and the deeply cherished, and the profoundly guiding spirits of the yet, a connection that the child, by the constant, and the deeply respectful presence of the grandparents, was the beginning, and the profoundly to feel, to understand, and to the deeply internalize as the fundamental, and the most sacred dimension of his or her own personal identity, an identity that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly animistic world, the identity that was not the isolated, the individual, the self, but the et, the clan, the eternal, and the unbreakable chain of the living, the dead, and the gods, a chain that the grandparents, by their patient and the deeply loving instruction, were the destined, and the profoundly obligated to strengthen, to extend, and to the eternally preserve. The grandfather, the AFI, who was, in the typical Viking age household, the retired, and the deeply respected husbandi, the former master of the farm, was, in his role as the teacher, the mentor, and the deeply revered storyteller, the primary, and the most influential source of the oral tradition, the free, the lore, the wisdom, the laws, the genealogies, and the profoundly inspiring tales of the raids, the battles, the voyages, and the deeply heroic deeds of the ancestors, a source that was, for the young boy, the model, the ideal, and the profoundly aspirational figure, the figure that the boy, by his own, and the deeply ambitious dreams, was the longing, and the profoundly striving to emulate, to equal, and to the ultimately surpass, a figure that was, in the Egil saga, the figure of the Kveldulfr, the evening wolf, the grandfather of the Egil. The man who was the legendary, and the deeply fearsome warrior, the Hammermer, the shape shifter, the man whose spirit, the Hamingja, the luck, was the inherited, and the profoundly manifest, in the grandson, the Egil, the greatest, and the most celebrated, of the Icelandic warrior poets, an inheritance that was, in the eyes of the saga, the direct, and the profoundly powerful result of the grandfather's influence, the upheldi, the bringing up, the transmission of the Hamingja, the luck, the spirit, the OSJ, the ancestral, and the profoundly sacred essence of the et. A transmission that the grandfather, by his presence, his stories, and his the deeply personal example, was the destined, and the profoundly obligated to accomplish, an accomplishment that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly pagan world, the ultimate, and the most sacred duty of the old to the young, the past to the future, the dead to the living, a duty that was, in the quiet, and the deeply intimate moments of the grandfather's teaching, the Kensla, the Frisla, the saga, the story, the mini, the memory, the moment that was, for the child, the moment of the profound, and the deeply transformative initiation into the full, and the deeply responsible membership of the et and the community of the gods and the ancestors. The grandmother, the Amma, who was, in the typical Viking age household, the retired, and the deeply revered Husfrija, the former mistress of the house, was, in her role as the teacher, the mentor, and the deeply beloved storyteller, the primary, and the most influential source of the oral tradition, the free, the lore, the wisdom, the medicinal knowledge, the magical spells, the galdra, the runner, the runes, and the profoundly intricate and the deeply complex art of the textile production, a source that was, for the young girl, the model, the ideal, and the profoundly aspirational figure, the figure that the girl, by her own, and the deeply ambitious dreams, was the longing, and the profoundly striving to emulate, to equal, and to the ultimately surpass, a figure that was, in the Laxdala saga, the figure of the under the deep-minded, the Jga, the great matriarch, the woman who was the legendary, and the deeply formidable leader. The settler, the land Namskona, the woman who, by her own hand, the claimed, the settled, and the deeply, wisely, distributed the vast territories of the Icelandic fjords, a woman whose Hamingja, the luck, the spirit, the profoundly female, and the deeply powerful essence was the inherited, and the profoundly manifest, in her granddaughters, the women of the Laxdæla, the women who were, in the saga's deeply tragic, and the profoundly complex narrative, the central and the most. The powerful figures, the figures whose lives, loves, and the deeply destructive feuds were the direct, and the profoundly consequential expression of the grandmother's legacy, a legacy that was, in the quiet, and the deeply intimate moments of the grandmother's teaching, the Kensla, the Fursla, the saga, the story, the mini, the memory, the moment that was, for the child, the moment of the profound, and the deeply transformative initiation into the full, and the deeply responsible membership of the Et and the community of the Desir, the female, ancestral spirits, the spirits that were, in the Norse, and the profoundly pagan religion, the ultimate, and the most the sacred guardians of the family, the farm, and the deeply cherished, and the profoundly eternal continuity of the life. The transition of the Viking child to the full, and the deeply responsible adult status, the moment of the mandom, the legal majority, the vigslu, the initiation, the bröllop, the wedding, was, in the Norse society, the most the significant, the most the dramatic, and the profoundly transformative rite of the passage, a passage that was, in its very nature, a passage that was the simultaneously the death of the child, the barn, the unmany, the dependent, the protected, the legally incompetent, and the profoundly subordinate being, and the birth of the adult, the mar, the kona, the fully responsible, the legally competent, the deeply gendered, and the profoundly autonomous member of the Et, the thing, and the community of the gods and the ancestors, a birth that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the essential, and the non-negotiable, prerequisite for the assumption of the full, the weight, the duties, and the deeply cherished rights of the adult life, the life of the marriage, the warfare, the trade, the property ownership, the political participation, and the profoundly personal, and the familial honor, an honor that was, in the Viking age, the ultimate, and the most the sacred value, a value that was, in the absence of the formal, and the legally recognized initiation, the utterly, and the permanently inaccessible to the child, the adolescent, and the deeply frustrated, and the profoundly dangerous young man or woman who was, in the limbo, the milli-stig, the between stage, of the post-childhood and the pre-adulthood, a limbo that was, in the Norse society, a state of the immense, the vulnerability, the powerlessness, and the deeply explosive potential for the violence, the rebellion, and the profoundly destabilizing breach of the social and the cosmic order, a order that the community, by the strict and the deeply formalized regulation of the initiation, the marriage, and the profoundly public recognition of the adult status, was the constantly, and the deeply, vigilantly, defending. The initiation of the boy, the Svein, the youth, the Dranger, the young warrior, into the full, and the deeply responsible status of the Mar, the man, the Bondi, the farmer, the Vikinger, the raider, was, in the Viking age, the Scandinavia, the often, the marked, by a specific, and a deeply dangerous test of the courage, the skill, the endurance, and the profoundly sacred, Hamingja, the personal, luck. A test that was, in its very nature, a test that was the designed, and the profoundly intentional, to bring the young man to the brink of the death, the annihilation, and the utter dissolution of the self, a brink that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the only, and the most the effective, gateway to the adult, and the profoundly sacred state of the warrior, the Dranger, the Vikinger, the man whose spirit, the hammer, the shaped soul, had been the permanently, and the irrevocably transformed by the ordeal, the sacrifice, and the deeply personal encounter with the divine, the demonic, and the profoundly mysterious forces of the Odin, the god of the initiation, the gallows, and the sacred warrior death. The Jomsvikinga saga, which we have examined in the earlier episode, provides the most the vivid, and the most the extreme, example of this initiation test, in the story of the admission of the young Van Akesson to the brotherhood of the Jomsvikings, a admission that was, in the saga's deeply heroic, and the profoundly tragic narrative, the conditional on the boy's ability to prove his courage, his skill, and his the deeply, unshakable, commitment to the code, a code that was, in its absolute, and the non-negotiable, demands, the ultimate, and the most the terrifying, expression of the Norse, and the profoundly, masculine, initiation ordeal, an ordeal that the van, by his extraordinary, and the deeply, moving, courage, the successfully, the past, a passing that was, in the saga's deeply, Christian, and the profoundly, redemptive, message, the prelude to the boy's glorious, and the profoundly tragic, career as the Jom's Viking champion, a career that was, in the end, the doomed, the heroic, and the eternally, remembered by the Skalds and the saga men, as the supreme, and the most the pure, expression of the pagan, and the profoundly, masculine, ideal, an ideal that was, in the quiet, and the deeply, domestic, world of the farm, the equally, the powerful, but the less the dramatic, in the simple, and the profoundly, significant, act of the boy's first, solo, hunting expedition, his first, successful, trading voyage, or his first, public speech at the thing, the assembly, the acts that were, in the eyes of the community, the clear, and the deeply, convincing, demonstrations of the boy's mandem, his manhood, his worthiness, and his the profoundly, cherished, right to the full, the legal, the social, and the emotional, privileges of the adult life, a life that the boy, by his successful, and the deeply, honored, completion of the initiation, was the now, the fully, and the permanently, entitled, and the profoundly, obligated, to lead. The initiation of the girl, the stulka, the maid, the mare, the virgin, the young kona, the young woman, into the full, and the deeply, responsible, status of the kona, the wife, the husfrija, the mistress, was, in the Viking age, the Scandinavia, the primarily, and the most the socially, visible, marked by the marriage, the bröllop, the wedding, the ritual that was, in its very nature, a ritual that was the transfer, the bjarfärsla, the bride conveyance of the woman from the protection, the vorn, and the authority, the fari of her father, the husbandi, to the protection, the vorn, and the authority, the fari of her husband, the bandi, a transfer that was, in the modern, and the deeply individualistic perspective, a profound, and a deeply disturbing loss of the female autonomy, but a transfer that was, in the Norse, and the profoundly patriarchal society, a transfer that was the simultaneously, the essential, and the deeply cherished acquisition of the new, and the profoundly powerful identity, the identity of the husfrija, the mistress of the house, the identity that was, in the law and the custom, the identity that was the endowed, with the immense, the economic, the social, and the deeply sacred authority, the authority that was, in the Gulathing law and the Gragas, the soul, and the deeply protected right of the wife and the mother, a right that the young woman, by her successful, and the deeply honored marriage was the now, the fully, and the permanently entitled, and the profoundly obligated to wield, a wielding that was, in the quiet, and the deeply domestic sphere of the longhouse, the wielding that was the true, and the most the powerful, expression of the female, adult status, a status that was, in the words of the Havamal, the Kona, the wife, the Eigen Kona, the own wife, the woman who was the delight and the deeply cherished companion of the man, the woman who was the keeper, the guardian, and the profoundly wise manager of the household, the woman who was the equal and the deeply respected partner in the great and the profoundly demanding enterprise of the life, a partnership that the young woman, by her patient and the deeply intensive training, her successful completion of the initiation, and her the deeply cherished and the profoundly honored marriage was the now, the fully, and the permanently prepared, and the profoundly obligated to fulfill. The impact of the Christianization of the Scandinavia, the long, slow, and the profoundly transformative process that began in the early 10th century and was, in its essential, the completed by the end of the 11th on the Upheldi, the bringing up of the Viking child, was, in its very nature, a revolution, a disruption, and the deeply fundamental reorientation of the entire ancient and the profoundly pagan system of the child rearing, the education, and the initiation, a revolution that was, in the eyes of the Christian missionaries, the kings, and the bishops, the essential, and the non-negotiable, prerequisite for the salvation, the civilization, and the deeply necessary integration of the North into the great, and the profoundly unified community of the Christian Europe, a community that was, in the words of the Adam of Bremen, the Ecclesia, the Church, the Corpus Christi, the body of the Christ, the mystical, and the profoundly hierarchical union of the faithful, a union that was, in its very essence, the antithesis, and the ultimate negation of the pagan, and the profoundly fragmented, the clan-based, the honor-bound, and the deeply violent world of the Viking Age, a world that the Church, with its absolute, and the deeply uncompromising monotheism, its universal, and the profoundly inclusive message of the love, the mercy, and the forgiveness, and it's the deeply institutional, and the profoundly literate culture was the determined to destroy, to replace, and to the ultimately redeem, a redemption that the child, who was the born in the new, and the deeply Christian era was the destined, and the profoundly obligated to the accept, the embrace, and to the deeply internalize as the soul, and the most the sacred path to the eternal life, a path that was, in the eyes of the Church, the path that was the only, and the most the certain, escape from the dark, and the profoundly terrifying fate of the hell, the pagan underworld, the Nastrand, the corpse shore, the place of the punishment, the NHCGR, the dragon, the corpse terror, the fate that was, in the old, and the deeply cherished belief, the inevitable, and the just destiny of the oath breakers, the murderers, and the profoundly sinful, the Ningar, the wretches, the outlaws, a fate that the Christian child, by the sacrament of the baptism, the skern, the cleansing, the vatni ossa, the water sprinkling, the ritual that was, in the new, and the deeply Christian order, the immediate, and the non-negotiable replacement of the old pagan nafestra, the name-giving, a ritual that was, in the eyes of the parents, the now, the transformed, from the invocation of the Hamingja, the ancestral, luck, into the washing away of the original, sin, the Urfa Synd, the sin of the Adam. The sin that was the inherited, by every human being, a washing that was, in the Christian theology, the essential, and the only, guarantee of the child's entry into the kingdom of the heaven, the Himmeriki, the realm of the God, the Christ, and the saints, a realm that was, in the new, and the deeply Christian imagination, the Jr, the earth, the Migger, the middle yard, the place of the struggle, the sorrow, and the death, and the hymn in, the heaven, the place of the eternal, the light, the joy, and the profoundly desired reunion with the beloved, and the deeply mourned dead. The education of the Christian child, the Christen barn, the Skerner barn, the baptized child, was, in the new, and the profoundly church-dominated order, the radically, the different from the old pagan, Uppeldi, a difference that was, in its very nature, a difference that was centered on the shift from the oral, the memory-based, the practical, the skill-oriented, and the deeply secular tradition of the et and the thing, to the written, the book-based, the theoretical, the moral, and the profoundly religious tradition of the church, the monastery, and the cathedral, school, a shift that was, in the eyes of the Christian clergy, the essential, and the deeply necessary, for the salvation, the civilization, and the profoundly desirable suppression of the old, and the deeply stubborn pagan, and the profoundly violent habits, the habits that were, in the words of the Gilathing law, the heendom, the heathen dom, the fornseger, the old custom, the blot, the sacrifice, the seer, the magic, the berserksganger, the frenzy, the habits that the church, with its absolute, and the deeply uncompromising condemnation, and the state, with its increasingly, the effective monopoly of the legitimate violence, were the determined to eradicate, a eradication that was, in the end, the largely, the successful, but a success that was, in the quiet, and the deeply remote regions of the north, the success that was the slow, the gradual, and the profoundly incomplete, a success that the child, who was the born in the 11th or the 12th century, in the isolated Icelandic or the Norwegian farm was the still, the deeply, and the profoundly, the air of the old, and the deeply cherished pagan traditions, the traditions that were the quietly, the secretly, and the profoundly, defiantly, transmitted from the grandparents to the grandchildren, the free. The lore, the mini, the memory, the soger, the sagas, the runner, the runes, the traditions that were, in the eyes of the church, the hindervitni, the superstition, the galdr, the spells, the folkingi, the sorcery, the traditions that were the dangerous, the subversive, and the profoundly demonic, but which were, in the hearts and the minds of the simple, the rural, and the deeply conservative people, the true, and the most the sacred inheritance of the ancestors, an inheritance that the child, by the silent, and the deeply attentive, listening to the old stories, was the beginning, and the profoundly, to receive, to cherish, and to the deeply, secretly, preserve, a preservation that was, in the long, and the profoundly, complex, history of the Scandinavian culture, the essential, and the most the enduring, condition of the survival of the Islandingasogur, the Heimskringla, the Edda, and the entire, and the profoundly, magnificent, body of the Old Norse literature, a literature that was, in the end, the ultimate, and the most the powerful, legacy of the pagan, and the profoundly, resilient, childhood of the North. The role of the children in the great, historical, events of the Viking Age, the raids, the battles, the settlements, the explorations, and the profoundly, transformative, political and the religious, conflicts, was, in the written, and the archaeological, record, the often, the invisible, the occluded, and the deeply, marginal, a reflection of the adult-centered, and the profoundly, masculine, bias of the sources, but a role that, when the carefully, and the deeply, critically examined, reveals, with a vivid, and a deeply, moving, clarity, the immense, and the profoundly, human, cost of the Viking expansion, a cost that was paid, not only by the countless, the anonymous, and the deeply, forgotten, victims of the raids, but by the Norse children themselves, the children who were the participants, the witnesses, the orphans, the slaves, and the deeply, resilient, survivors of the great, and the profoundly, violent, upheavals that reshaped the map of the early medieval Europe, a upheaval that the child, who was the born in the turmoil, and the deeply, dangerous, world of the 9th and the 10th centuries, was the destined, and the profoundly, obligated, to the navigate, to the endure, and to the deeply, adapt, a navigation, an endurance, and an adaptation that were, in the eyes of the modern, and the deeply, humanitarian, observer, the profoundly, heroic, and the deeply, tragic, testament to the resilience, the courage and the deeply indomitable, spirit of the young, a spirit that was, in the words of the sagas, the barn, the child, the unger, the young, the ohredder, the unafraid, the okunner, the unknowing, the innocent, the spirit that was, in the end, the most the precious, and the most the vulnerable, of all the human resources, a resource that the Viking Age, in its relentless, and the profoundly, destructive, energy, the consumed, the wasted, and the deeply, tragically, the ignored, but a resource that was, in the silent, and the deeply, enduring, memory of the sagas, the rune stones, and the children's graves, the eternally, the remembered, and the profoundly, mourned. The participation of the young boys and the adolescents in the Viking raids and the battles was, in the Norse, and the profoundly, martial, culture, not the exception, but the rule, a rule that was, in its very nature, a rule that was the direct, and the profoundly, logical, consequence of the early, and the deeply, intensive, military, training, the training that was the essential, and the non-negotiable component of the upheldy, the bringing up, of the male, child, a training that was, in the eyes of the society, the necessary, and the most the sacred preparation for the mandomer, the adulthood, the Viking, the raiding, the herner, the warfare, the activities that were, in the Viking Age, the primary, and the most the honored sources of the wealth, the status, and the profoundly cherished male identity, an identity that the young boy, who was the eager and the deeply ambitious to prove himself, to emulate his father, his older brothers, and his the deeply admired heroes, was the longing, and the profoundly striving to assume, as soon and as the fully as the possible. The Egil saga, which we have already cited, provides the most famous, and the most deeply shocking, example of this early, military, participation in the story of the Egil, who, at the age of the 12, the accompanied his brother, the Arelafar, on a Viking raid to the Kurland, on the eastern shore of the Baltic, a raid that was, in the saga's vivid, and the deeply violent description, the brutal, the bloody, and the profoundly successful, a raid in which the young Egil, distinguished himself by his courage, his ferocity, and the deeply precocious skill with the axe and the sword, a skill that was, in the saga's deeply admiring, and the profoundly approving narrative, the clear, and the deeply cherished sign of the boysen-born Hamingja, his luck, his warrior spirit, his destiny as the greatest, and the most feared, of the Icelandic warriors. A destiny that was, in the eyes of the saga's medieval, Icelandic audience, the supreme, and the most admirable, of the human achievements, an achievement that was, in the quiet, and the deeply peaceful, world of the modern, and the profoundly different society, the deeply disturbing, and the profoundly, morally ambiguous, a reflection of the immense, and the profoundly alien, gulf that separates the modern, Western, humanitarian, values from the harsh, and the deeply martial, code of the Viking Age. The experience of the children during the great migrations, the settlement of the Iceland, the Greenland, and the Vinland, the North America, in the late 9th and the early 10th centuries, was, in the historical and the archaeological record, the experience that was the often the overlooked, but the experience that was, in its very nature, the experience of the immense, the physical, the emotional, and the deeply psychological stress, a stress that was, for the young, the profoundly challenging, and the often, the deeply traumatic, a stress that was the product of the long, and the deeply dangerous sea voyages, the cramped, the wet, and the profoundly unhealthy conditions of the merchant vessel, the constant, and the ever-present threat of the shipwreck, the storm, the starvation, and the disease, the sudden, and the profoundly disorienting departure from the familiar, the beloved, and the deeply comforting landscape of the home, the Heim, the Et, the Felag, the community of the living, the dead, and the gods, and the arrival in a new, a strange, a cold, a harsh, and the profoundly alien land, a land that was, in the words of the Landnámabók, the Book of the Settlements, the Obygg, the uninhabited, the Or, the desolate, the Jockal, the glacier, the Ron, the lava, the land that was the challenging, the terrifying, and the deeply demanding, of the utmost, the courage, the resilience, and the profoundly cooperative effort of the entire family, an effort that the child, who was the often the too young and the too weak to contribute in the significant, the physical way, was the nevertheless the deeply and the profoundly affected by the stress, the anxiety, and the deeply haunting grief of the adults, the grief for the lost home, the lost kin, and the profoundly beloved world of the past, a grief that the child, by the patient, and the deeply comforting presence of the mother, the fosterer, and the grandparents, was the beginning, and the profoundly to learn, to share, and to the deeply internalize as the fundamental, and the most the sacred component of the new, and the profoundly cherished identity of the Landnámsmaður, the settler, the Nibli, the new dweller, the ancestor of the future, and the deeply proud generations of the Icelanders and the Greenlanders, identity that was, in the long, and the profoundly complex history of the Norse diaspora, the identity that was the forged, not in the glory of the battle, but in the quiet, the patient, and the profoundly resilient endurance of the child, the survivor, the Af Kfami, the descendant, the bearer of the Hamingja, the luck, the spirit, the eternal, and the unbreakable chain of the Et. The role of the children in the domestic economy of the Viking Age, farm, the boo, the jar, the estate, was, in the subsistence, and the profoundly labor-intensive agriculture of the North, the absolutely, the essential, and the non-negotiable, a role that was, in its very nature, a role that was the direct, and the profoundly functional expression of the fundamental Norse principle of the Jafnir. The balance, the fair measure, the mutual, and the deeply reciprocal obligation, the skilda, the duty that was, in the words of the Havamal, the work, the deed, the action that was the true, and the only, measure of the human worth, a worth that the child, from the earliest age, was the taught, and the deeply conditioned to the demonstrate, through his or her contribution, however the small, the humble, or the deeply unacknowledged, to the collective. And the profoundly communal enterprise of the survival, a survival that was, in the harsh, and the deeply unforgiving environment of the North, the survival that was the dependent, not on the individual, the genius, or the heroic effort, but on the constant, the tireless, and the profoundly coordinated labor of every member of the household, the heim, the home, the family, a labor that the child, who was the barn, the unmany, the young, the inexperienced, was the nevertheless, the expected, and the deeply obligated to the perform to the best of his or her ability, a performance that was, in the eyes of the parents, the community, and the gods, the essential, and the most the sacred component of the uphelding, the bringing up, the training, the process of the transformation of the dependent, the helpless, and the profoundly self-centered infant, into the responsible, the reliable, and the deeply communal-minded adult. A transformation that was, in the quiet, and the deeply unassuming rhythm of the daily, and the seasonal tasks, the smir, the work, the the occupation, the starf, the labor, the rhythm that was, for the child, the primary, and the most the effective teacher, a teacher that was the patient, the relentless, and the profoundly wise, a teacher that the child, by the constant, and the deeply physical engagement, was the beginning, and the profoundly to respect, to trust, and to the deeply internalize, as the fundamental, and the most the sacred, law of the life, a law that was, in the words of the Havamal, the dull, the concealment, the vit, the wisdom, the gien, the silence, the hlj, the listening, the law of the observation, the imitation, the practice, the patience, and the profoundly humble, and the deeply grateful acceptance of the small, the essential, and the eternally recurring duties, the duties that were the true, and the most the enduring foundation of the human, and the cosmic order, a order that the child, by his or her patient, and the deeply uncomplaining labor was the destined, and the profoundly obligated to uphold. The specific tasks that the Viking child performed varied, of course, according to the age, the gender, the season, and the particular economic orientation of the farm, orientation that was, in the coastal regions, the dependent on the fishing, the sea mammal, hunting, and the seaborne trade, while in the inland and the mountainous regions, the pastoralism, the dairy production, and the deeply seasonal transhumance, the cedar, the summer mountain farm were the dominant modes of the subsistence, a variation that was, in the child's experience, the source of the immense, the diversity, and the deeply enriching exposure to the different skills, the environments, and the profoundly challenging demands of the life, a exposure that was, in the modern, and the deeply specialized world, the largely, the lost, but which was, for the Viking child, the essential, and the most the effective preparation for the adult, and the profoundly adaptable, and the deeply resilient career. The young boy, who was the destined for the role of the Bondi, the farmer, the fisherman, the hunter, was, from the age of the 6 or the 7, the assigned to the tasks of the increasing, the responsibility and the physical demand, the herding of the sheep, the goats, and the cattle, in the remote, and the often, the dangerous, mountain, pastures, a task that was, in the long, and the deeply solitary, summer days. The task that was the training, not only of the physical endurance but of the patience, the independence, the deeply intimate knowledge of the natural world, the behavior of the animals, the signs of the weather, the edible and the medicinal plants, and the ever-present and the deeply haunting threat of the predators, the wolf, the bear, the eagle, the troll, the vader, the spirits, the threats that the child, by his constant vigilance, his courage, and his the deeply developing skill with the bow, the sling, and the Kaspjot, the javelin, was the beginning, and the profoundly, to master, a mastery that was, in the eyes of his father, his grandfather, and the community, the clear, and the deeply, convincing, evidence of the boy's mandom, his manhood, his worthiness, and his the profoundly, cherished, right to the full, the legal, the social, and the emotional, privileges of the adult life, a life that the boy, by his patient, and the deeply, uncomplaining labor, was the steadily, and the profoundly, the inevitably, approaching. The young girl, who was the destined for the role of the Husfrija, the mistress of the house, the weaver, the spinner, the dairy maid, the healer, was, from the age of the 5 or the 6, the assigned to the tasks of the increasing, the responsibility and the technical demand, the tasks that were the centered in the longhouse, the scaly, the main, living hall, and its surrounding outbuildings, the burr, the storehouse. The eldest, the kitchen, the smedja, the forge, the vefstofa, the weaving workshop, a workshop that was, in its very nature, a workshop that was the female domain, the kvenahus, the women's house, the domain that the young girl, by her constant, and the deeply attentive presence, was the beginning, and the profoundly, to learn, to understand, and to the deeply internalize as the center, and the most the sacred space of her future, and the profoundly powerful identity, an identity that was, in the quiet, and the deeply rhythmic labor of the spindle, the sneelda, the distaff, the rocker, the loom, the vefster, the skay, the weaving sword, the klejesteiner, the loom weights, the labor that was, in its very essence, the labor of the transformation, the hamfurier, the shape-shifting, the magical, and the profoundly female power, the power to turn the raw, the chaotic, the utterly useless wool, the yule, the floki, the two, into the warm, the strong, the windproof, and the deeply essential cloth, the vaml, the segel, the sail, the klee, the garment, the power that was, in the eyes of the Norse, the power that was the equal, and the often, the superior, of the male, and the sea-born adventure, a power that the young girl, by her patient, and the deeply, uncomplaining, labor, was the destined, and the profoundly, to inherit, to perfect, and to the eternally, transmit, to her own daughters, a transmission that was, in the quiet, and the deeply, hidden, spaces of the longhouse, the true, and the most the enduring heartbeat of the Viking age, a heartbeat that was, in the final, and the most the decisive, analysis, the heartbeat of the child, the future, the hope, and the profoundly, resilient, and the deeply, cherished, spirit of the North. The study of the Viking childhood, the uppeldi, the bringing up, has, in the recent decades, been revolutionized by the integration of the new, and the profoundly, sophisticated scientific techniques, the ADNA, the ancient DNA, the stable isotope analysis, the high-resolution radiocarbon dating, the paleopathology, the study of the ancient disease, and the deeply detailed and the profoundly empathetic re-examination of the material, culture, the toys, the tools, the graves, and the deeply intimate spatial arrangements of the longhouse, an integration that has, for the first time, allowed the modern historian, the archaeologist, and the profoundly curious public to see, with a clarity that was, for the centuries, the utterly impossible, the true, the complex, and the profoundly human reality of the lives of the young, in the Viking age, a reality that is, in its very nature, a reality that is both the deeply familiar, in its fundamental, emotional, and the psychological dimensions, and the profoundly alien, in its harsh, its pragmatic, and its the deeply early, and the intensely responsible expectations, a reality that is, in the words of the archaeologists, the barndomr, the childhood, the barna evi, the children's life, the young evi, the youth life, the life that was the lived, the experienced, and the profoundly endured by the countless, the anonymous, and the deeply forgotten children of the North, the children who were the builders, the inheritors, and the ultimately the victims of the great, and the profoundly terrifying, and the deeply glorious phenomenon that we call the Viking Age. The future of this research, which is, in the coming years, the certain, to be further, the transformed by the advances in the ADNA, the proteomics, the analysis of the ancient proteins, and the deeply sophisticated digital modeling of the ancient environments holds the promise of an even, the deeper, and a far more than nuanced understanding, an understanding that will, in all the probability, continue to challenge, to subvert, and to the profoundly enrich the modern and the deeply cherished image of the Vikings, an image that is, in the 21st century, the more the complex, the more the human, and the more the deeply moving than ever before, an image that includes at its very heart the figure of the child, the barn, the unmany, the young, the innocent, the resilient, the stoic, and the profoundly hopeful, the figure that is, in the end, the true, and the enduring legacy of the Viking Age. The ADNA, the ancient genome analysis, which is, at the time of this recording, the expanding, and the deeply promising field, has the potential to reveal, with an unprecedented and a deeply precise detail, the genetic, the familial, the ethnic, and the profoundly personal relationships of the Viking children, the relationships that were the central, and the sacred component of the clan, the relationships that were, in the historical and the literary record, the often, the occluded, the ambiguous, and the deeply contested, a contestation that was, in the sagas, the source of the great, and the profoundly tragic feuds, the Edvig, the clan killings, the Hefnd, the vengeance, the the shame, the Jafnir, the injustices that the ADNA, by its silent, and the deeply impartial, testimony of the blood, the bone, and the tooth, may, in the future, be able to illuminate, to clarify, and to ultimately, the resolve, a resolution that will, in the eyes of the scientists, be the final, and the decisive, victory of the modern, and the profoundly objective, Silframar, the weigher, the assayer, the auditor, over the ancient, and the deeply fascinating, but the often, the deeply misleading, narratives of the saga, the myth, and the legend. The isotope analysis, which can reveal the geographical, the origins, the mobility, and the diet of the individual, children, the born, the unmany, the young, has already, in the major studies of the cemeteries of the Birka, the Kaupang, and the Hedeby, demonstrated that the Viking world was the far more the cosmopolitan, the diverse, and the deeply interconnected, than the traditional. The nationalistic, and the deeply romanticized narratives have allowed a diversity that was in the persons of the children, the fostri, the foster child, the ambat, the slave girl, the RLL, the slave boy, the Viking, the young raider, the Kop Mar, the young trader, the Landnams Mar, the young settler, the physically, the embodied, and the profoundly lived embodiment that the child, by his or her very existence, was the testament to the immense and the profoundly complex forces of the migration, the trade, the violence, and the deeply human and the profoundly ambivalent encounter of the cultures, an encounter that was, in the Viking Age, the encounter that was the simultaneously, the destructive, and the creative, the terrifying, and the inspiring, the fatal, and the profoundly fertile, the matrix of the new, and the deeply hybrid identities, the identities that were the future, and the enduring legacy of the North. The new, and the deeply sensitive, excavation, and the recording techniques, the microstratigraphy, the soil chemistry, the high-resolution photography, and the 3D laser scanning are, in the modern archaeological practice, the enabling, the detection, and the profoundly detailed documentation of the traces, the ameli, the evidence, the murky, the signs of the children's presence. The presence that was, in the past, the often, the invisible, and the deeply ignored ignorance. That was, in its very nature, ignorance that was the product of the adult-centered, and the profoundly masculine bias of the traditional archaeology, a bias that the new, and the deeply inclusive, and the profoundly child-focused approaches are, at the last, the actively, and the successfully, the correcting, a correction that is, in the silent, and the deeply fragile traces of the small footprints. The FOT spore, the tiny fingerprints, the finger mark on the clay, the leer, the worn, and the deeply polished patches on the floor of the longhouse, the gulf, the marks of the endless, and the profoundly patient play of the children, the leaker, the artiti, the gammon, the joy that was, in the dark, and the deeply oppressive world of the northern winter, the only, and the most powerful, light, a light that the archaeology, by its patient, and the deeply loving attention to the small, the fragile, and the deeply human, is, at the last, the beginning, and the profoundly, to reveal, a revelation that is, in the words of the sagas, the ljos, the light, the sandleaker, the truth that is the most precious, and the most the enduring, of all the human discoveries, a discovery that the Viking child, the barn, the Ungmeni, the af Kfami, the descendant, the ancestor of us all, is, in the final, and the most the profound, analysis, the giver, and the eternally, the receiver, of the ultimate, and the most the sacred, gift of the Hamingja, the luck, the spirit, the eternal, and the unbreakable, chain of the life, a chain that the modern, and the deeply curious, and the profoundly respectful observer, is the honored, and the deeply obligated, to the recognize, the protect, and the eternally, to cherish. We have traveled, in the course of this documentary, from the first, gasping, and the fiercely contested breath of the newborn on the cold, and the deeply perilous floor of the 9th century longhouse, to the quiet, and the profoundly heroic death of the old, and the deeply cherished grandfather, the AFI, the Amma, the living, and the eternally revered embodiment of the ancestors. And we have seen that the Viking childhood, the uphelding, the bringing up, the long, harsh, and the deeply intentional process of the training, the conditioning, and the profoundly transformative initiation that forged the resilient, the independent, the fiercely proud, and the profoundly violent human beings of the Viking Age was not, in the deepest, and the most structurally essential sense, a footnote, a sideshow, or the merely domestic prelude to the great, male, and the sea-born adventure of the sagas, but the true, the hidden, and the utterly indispensable foundation of the entire, astonishing, and the deeply terrifying phenomenon, a foundation that was the built, not on the abstract, the theoretical, or the remote, but on the daily, the physical, the emotional, and the profoundly human experience of the child, the barn, the Ungmeni, the young, the innocent, the resilient, the stoic, and the profoundly hopeful, the figure that was, in the quiet, and the deeply unassuming rhythm of the farm, the forest, and the longhouse, the true and the most the enduring engine of the Viking Age, an engine that was powered by the love, the labor, the sacrifice, and the deeply cherished memory of the countless, the anonymous, and the deeply forgotten parents, grandparents, and the fosterers, the women and the men who, in the dark, the silent, and the profoundly unyielding grip of the northern winter, the cold, the hunger, and the ever-present, the shadow of the death, the devoted, the patient, and the eternally selfless effort to the care, the teach, and the deeply protect the young, an effort that was, in the eyes of the modern, and the profoundly different world, the deeply heroic, and the profoundly moving testament to the universal, and the eternally human capacity for the love, the hope, and the deeply stubborn, and the profoundly resilient belief in the future, a future that was, in the words of the sagas, the Vaughn, the hope, the frant, the future, the born. The children who were the messengers, the carriers, and the eternally cherished bearers of the Hamingja, the luck, the spirit, the eternal, and the unbreakable chain of the Et. A chain that was, in the end, the true, and the most powerful legacy of the Viking Age, a legacy that is, in the quiet, and the deeply reflective moments of the modern, and the profoundly secular world, the legacy that is the still, the visible, the tangible, and the profoundly inspiring in the resilience, the independence, and the deeply cherished cultural identity of the modern Scandinavian peoples, identity that was forged, not in the glory of the battle, but in the quiet, the patient, and the profoundly resilient endurance of the child, the survivor, the af Kfami, the descendant, the bearer of the ancient, and the eternally sacred flame of the North. If you have been moved, inspired, or the deeply fascinated by this hidden, and the profoundly human Story of the Viking childhood, the story of the children who were the forged, in the ice, the iron, and the utterly, unrelenting, fire of the North. Please leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so that you will not miss the next, the deep, and the illuminating journey into the lost, the forgotten, and the deeply, astonishing, stories of our shared human history. Share this documentary with the parents, the educators, the history lovers, and the deeply curious minds in your life, who deserve to know the true and the profoundly powerful legacy of the Viking nursery, the nursery that was, in truth, a factory, a forge, and a temple, dedicated to the production of the most resilient, the most adaptable, and the most utterly relentless generation of survivors that history has ever known. And let us know, in the comments below, which of the aspects of the Viking childhood, the harsh, early, training, the sacred, name-giving, the poignant, graves of the children, or the enduring, and the deeply, inspiring, resilience of the young, you found the most surprising, the most moving, or the most unforgettable. Your engagement, your curiosity, and your passion for the hidden, and the true, history of the world are the fuel that drives this channel, and I am deeply, and sincerely, grateful for your presence, your attention, and your company on this long, dark, and the utterly unforgettable journey into the heart of the Viking Age, a heart that was, in the end, the heart of the child, the barn, the unmany, the Afkvani, the descendant, and the eternal, and the most sacred ancestor of us all. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.